Marek, Guardians of Hades Romance Series, Book 4, written by Felicity Heaton, narrated by Eric G. Dove. Chapter 1. He had never been one for believing in signs, but as Marek watched the skull made of bubbles slide down the glass shower screen, a bad feeling stirred deep in his gut. He finished scrubbing the suds from his hair and slicked it back, running both hands over his head as his eyes strayed back to the skull, now stretching and deforming into something resembling Edvard Munch's painting, The Scream. It meant nothing. Omens weren't real. If the bad feeling came from anywhere, it was because things had gone too quiet since the Wraith had broken into the Tokyo mansion and rescued the shapeshifter female he and his brothers had managed to capture. It had looked as if she was going to be a valuable source of information, that Escher could break her down and convince her to talk if he had enough time. Marek and his 6 brothers had held her in their grasp for only a few hours before the Wraith had used the memories he had stolen from Escher to penetrate the barrier around the mansion and had whisked her away through a portal. Now they were back to square one. They had an enemy and they had no clue how many were in their ranks or what they planned to do next. All they knew was that this band of demons wanted to destroy the gates he and his brothers protected between the mortal world and their home, the underworld, to merge the two realms into one they would control. Karis was still annoyed about the fact they had lost their only source of information, as well as other things. Marek couldn't remember the last time his oldest brother had said more than 2 words to him. At every meeting Marek attended, Karis spoke to the others about their reports and what he wanted them to do next. But when it came to Marek, all Karis dished out was the cold shoulder. Marek cursed Enyo under his breath, not foolish enough to do it aloud in case the damned goddess of war was able to hear him. It was time she overcame whatever it was that stopped her from facing Fax and his brother, before she ended up getting Marek killed. The next time she showed up on Marek's doorstep, she was getting the cold shoulder treatment. Or he would damn well teleport to wherever Karis was, so she was forced to see his brother again. It was about time they both faced their feelings. Karis was as in denial as Enyo was. The skull continued to mock him. Marek swiped the side of his left hand across the glass, obliterating it, and shut off the water. He didn't believe in signs. He made his own destiny. The Moirai could tell him the future all they wanted, but what good were the seers when they couldn't tell him the details? He and his brothers had been stuck in the mortal world for 200 years, thanks to the Fates and their sketchy facts. Their father, Hades, had banished them from the underworld to protect the gates and await the attack the Fates had foreseen, believing it would motivate them and give them reason to focus all of their effort on their mission so they could return home. 2 centuries of waiting and the enemy had finally made themselves known. War was coming. Marek couldn't wait. His gut swirled with a dark hunger, one that had been steadily building over the last 2 weeks and pressed him to obey it. He flexed his fingers as his thoughts trod a dark path, feeding that hunger with images of beautiful carnage, of walls painted crimson, and blood rolling down his body as he stood amidst the aftermath of a battle. The image wasn't one he had witnessed, but one that was to come. Marek could tell the future, too, in his own way. He could predict the result of a hunt, because he always won. Nothing stood between him and the high of victory, not when he was hunting. His blood burned with need as his hunger got the better of him, and he stepped out of the shower, unable to deny it any longer. Tonight. He would make that vision real tonight. He dried off and scrubbed a towel against his dark hair, mussing the waves into curls as he stared at himself in the mirror. He wasn't surprised to find his normally brown eyes were black with the dark need to hunt, revealing the depth of his hunger. He tried to keep his mind on other things as he tugged on his trunks and then his black combat trousers and pulled on a tight black t-shirt, but his focus kept slipping, filling his head with pleasing images of fighting that roused another need in his veins, a trickle of pleasure that warmed him. His eyes slid shut as anticipation built, the thought of what was to come making him want to rush. As always. He clenched his fists, savoring the sting of his nails biting into his palms, and tamped down the urges, clawing back control. He would have his high soon enough. It was better he remained focused during the fight. Afterwards, when the 12 vermin he had been tracking for the last 2 weeks were little more than fizzing piles of flesh and bone, He could indulge himself and enjoy the bliss and satisfaction that came from killing them. Vampires. His father Hades would be angry with him if he discovered Marek's need to slay vampires, a species his father viewed as allies. His brothers would probably be just as furious. Knowing that didn't stop him. It couldn't stop him. The vampires needed to pay. He had tried to deny the hunger to kill them, and it hadn't ended well. The compulsion was strong, so powerful that it had driven him into his darker side, a side that came from Hades' blood in his veins, and he had lost all control, becoming a slave to it. His second eldest brother, Ares, had found him a week later, caked with blood and grime. Apparently, he had located him by following the trail of carnage Marek had left in his wake. By his brother's estimate, close to 1,000 demons had lost their lives to Marek's blade, and on top of that, he had slaughtered 5 hellspawn. Hellspawn were what he and his brothers called the demon breeds that Hades deemed acceptable, ones who still served him and were allowed to travel freely between the mortal world and the underworld. Hades had forgiven him for killing them. He doubted his father would forgive him if he became aware of the thousands of vampires he had slaughtered since then, all of them in cold blood while fully aware of what he was doing. Marek stalked into his bedroom, the terracotta tiles cool beneath his feet despite the thick heat of summer. Insects buzzed and chirruped outside, their song a soothing melody as he breathed deeply to focus, centering himself as he prepared for battle. He felt the earth deep beneath him, sensed it surrounding him, and he closed his eyes as he allowed his connection to it to calm him further and push out the frantic need building within him. Patience. There were 12 vampires in that nest in Barcelona, and he was going to butcher every single one of them. Nothing was going to stop that from happening tonight. He rounded his oak double bed that stood against the wall opposite the bathroom and opened a drawer on the side table to its right. His dark gaze landed on the one thing it contained, and the hunger roared back to life inside him. He swallowed and reached into the drawer, his eyes slipping shut and pleasure rolling in on the wake of his hunger as his fingers made contact with the leather hilt of the blade. It was smooth beneath his touch, worn from centuries of use. He bit back a groan as he curled his fingers around it and lifted the blade, felt the delicious weight of it in his palm. He opened his eyes and looked down at it, shivered as he drew the curved knife from its sheath, and the silver blade caught the low lights, reflecting them up at him. The beauty of it hit him hard in the way it always did, had him transfixed as he took in every nick in the razor-sharp blade, and recounted all the vampires he had killed with it, using the silver it contained to send them to their final deaths. The need to hunt condensed inside him, boiled and raged, pushed at him until he surrendered to it. He swiftly sheathed the blade and jammed it into the waist of his fatigues, and focusing on his destination, he summoned his ability to teleport. Darkness whirled around him, consumed him as he took a single step forwards. Familiar sensation washed through him, his connection to the underworld lasting only a heartbeat before he emerged from the teleport. It was comforting nonetheless, and the closest he had been to home in 200 years. He landed in a cobbled alley surrounded by old cream stone buildings. The air was thicker here in Barcelona than in Seville, heavy with moisture that made it hard to breathe as the stifling heat bore down on him. He gave himself a moment to adjust to the summer temperatures, and then silently moved along the alley, using the shadows as cover as he stealthily approached the arched entrance of the vampire nest. His senses sharpened as he focused them ahead of him, eager to count the number of foes awaiting him. Only it wasn't 12 signatures that popped up on his internal radar. It was only 5. Marek cursed and moved faster, drawing his blade from its sheath at the same time. He could still eliminate these 5, taking the edge off his hunger, and then he would wait for the rest to return. He reached the entrance of the building and stopped dead, as the scent of spilled vampire blood hit him, together with a feminine grunt and a hiss. There hadn't been any females among the vampires. Was it a vampire or a victim? He eased the heavy wooden doors open and slipped inside. His eyes rapidly adjusted to the darkness that clung to the ground floor of the building, revealing the courtyard. And a woman. She stood in the center of the courtyard, the low lights reflecting off her caramel-colored hair as it tumbled around her shoulder, shifting in waves as she turned her head left and then right, eyeing the 4 male vampires moving to flank her. If it hadn't been for the fact that she was facing off against the vampires, he would have thought her one of them with her tight dark clothing. She matched their style perfectly. Calf-height black leather boots showing over her tight navy jeans, and a form-fitting black tank revealing her toned figure. A thin cut slashed up her left arm, a crimson trail from it reaching her elbow. Darkness stirred inside him as she took in the vampires, her wide, luminous hazel eyes bright with what looked a lot like fear. A startling new urge blasted through Marek in response. A need to protect her. A dark-haired vampire facing her licked his fangs. Not on Marek's watch. Darkness rushed through him, sweet and addictive, dangerously seductive as it subdued his softer emotions, leaving only raw rage and a black hunger for violence behind. His nails sharpened into claws, canines lengthening to match those the vampire was flashing at the woman, his would-be victim. Marek leaned his weight forwards and readied his blade, his gaze locking onto the male. Mind racing to calculate everything about him, from his weight and height, to which foot he favored, and any possible weapons he had concealed on his body. Satisfied that the vampire wouldn't stand a chance, Marek pressed down on his right foot, intending to launch at the male. Only the woman picked that moment to yell a battle cry and spin on her heel, a silver blur shining around her as she gracefully pirouetted, and stabbed the vampire nearest Marek right through his heart with a short sword. Marek rocked back on his heels. She wasn't a victim. She was a warrior. Breathtaking as she ducked beneath the blow from the blond male behind her and lashed out with her leg in a fluid sweep that looked as if she had performed it 1,000 times. She caught the male's ankles, toppling him, and spun back up to her full height as she brought her blade around. It sliced clean through the throat of the vampire she had stabbed, cleaving his head from his body as he frantically clutched at the bubbling wound in his chest. The vampire slumped to land by what appeared to be the fizzing remains of another vampire, giving Marek a better view of the warrior as she took on the remaining 3. Part of Marek growled at him to intervene, to protect her as he had intended. The rest of him was struck dumb by how gracefully she moved as she twisted and turned, blocked and attacked, undeterred by the way the vampires evaded her blows. He had never seen anything like her. It wasn't fear that flashed in her hazel eyes as she spun on her heel and jammed her blade into the gut of the blonde vampire. It was excitement, pleasure, the same thrill he felt as he watched her. Who was she? The hunger that had gone dormant inside him the moment he had set eyes on her returned with a vengeance, snarling a black demand in his head as he watched her fighting the vampires, fighting his vampires. It didn't matter who she was. She was intruding on his battle, had ruined his plans for the night. These vermin were his to kill. The woman slashed her blade across the leg of the blonde vampire, cutting deep into his thigh through his black jeans, delivering another deadly blow of silver, judging by how the vampire she had managed to kill was slowly melting away to nothing. She leaned over and grasped the male by his hair, stared into his eyes as the silver consumed him, tearing pained hisses from between his clenched teeth as he convulsed. Her first mistake. A fatal one. She had taken her eyes off the remaining 2. The tall, dark-haired male grabbed her from behind, fisted her fall of caramel hair, and pulled her head back, ripping a pained cry from her lips. The vampire's eyes blazed red as he bent his head to pierce her delicate neck with his filthy fangs. Marek growled from the shadows, the feral snarl peeling from him before he could contain it, as the need to protect her roared back to the fore, stealing control of him again. The woman tensed. The vampires froze. Their glowing scarlet eyes edged towards him. Marek launched at them on a roar. Chapter 2. Disgust rolled through Katerina, and not for the first time that night. She stalked the streets, her blood on fire as she tailed 2 men, keeping her distance so she didn't rouse suspicion. She blended with the tourists whenever they stopped, snapped pictures with her phone, and played the innocent, admiring the cathedral that towered at the edge of the Gothic quarter in her city. Barcelona. Out of the corner of her eye, the men moved on. She broke away from the group of twittering tourists gathered on the broad paved pedestrian area and headed towards the trees that lined the buildings opposite the cathedral, where there were fewer people. She reached the intersection with one of the main shopping avenues and paused to seek her prey, ignoring the street vendors as they tried to sell her everything from things that squeaked when you blew air through them to illuminated mini helicopters launched into the air using rubber bands. The two men took a left, heading deeper into the Gothic quarter. She glared at their backs. Vampires. In her city. She couldn't let that pass. It was her mission to free Barcelona of their clutches. Her heart ached as she thought about her older brother Guillaume. How many innocents in her city had fallen victim of these fiends, murdered or worse, turned as Guillaume had been and left to face an eternity of suffering? Rage burned in her veins, as fierce as the day it had ignited 9 years ago when her brother had been turned, and condensed into a fire as eternal as her brother's suffering. She readied herself, harnessing that anger as she tracked the vampires up the sloping alley to the right of the cathedral, a path many tourists took. She wouldn't let these two vampires hurt any of them. Their reign of terror ended tonight. She slipped her hand beneath the back of her black leather jacket and stroked the hilt of the short blade strapped to her back. The feel of it comforted her as she followed the men deeper into the warren of alleyways that branched off from the Carrera del Bisbe. The streets grew darker, the lamps mounted on the walls of the old sandstone buildings spaced further apart, as she left the more popular part of the quarter behind. She paused at a junction, flattening her back against the wall as she listened. Male voices carried along the street. More than two of them. She peeked around the corner, a quick glance before she darted into cover again. There were 4 of them now, loitering outside one of the Gothic buildings. She risked another peek and frowned. They were gone. She peered into the darkness at the other end of the alley and then looked both ways along the street where she stood. They couldn't have disappeared. They must have gone into the building at her back. Katerina emerged from her hiding spot and studied the building. The lower windows were barred to protect them. She moved a few feet along the alley. An arched entrance stood where the vampires had been, the dark wooden door sealed shut. She doubled back and did a lap of the building, trying to spot another exit. None that she could tell belonged to the building where the vampires were hiding. One exit and barred windows didn't bode well for her. She cursed low. Her stomach churned, but she pressed her hand to it and breathed through the nerves as she walked back towards the front of the building. She wouldn't let it stop her. She couldn't. One of the vampires inside the nest might be her brother's sire. Killing that vampire would free Guillaume. She was sure of it. Her chest throbbed as she thought about him, about how pale and gaunt he was now, a shadow of the man she had once known. All because of a vampire. She would free him of his curse before it consumed him. That need, that desire, kept her strong as she readied herself. Killing the vampire who had sired Guillaume had to be the answer. She was sure of it. Everything else she had tried had done nothing to help him. This was her last hope. Their last hope. If she had to slay every vampire on the planet to save her brother, she would do it. If she had to give her life for this cause, she wouldn't hesitate. Her brother meant everything to her, and he deserved to live again without the sickness that plagued him. Katerina pushed her leather jacket off her left shoulder and drew her blade from beneath it. She sucked down a deep breath, steeling herself for what she was about to do. Vampires had sharp senses, which meant she needed the element of surprise, and the only way to get that was to disarm them with the scent of blood. It was dangerous when she wasn't sure how many vampires were inside the building, but it was far less dangerous than just breaking in and attacking them. She might be able to cut down a few of them before they realized what was happening. She drew the edge of the blade across her upper arm and hissed through her teeth as fire blazed in its wake. The scent of her blood was swift to permeate the humid air, turning her stomach as she sheathed her sword. She rubbed her arm, encouraging it to bleed, and pulled her jacket back up. Not wearing it so the vampires could get a good look at her wound would be better, but she couldn't risk them seeing her weapon. She had to keep it hidden until she was ready to strike. Her phone vibrated in her pocket and she pulled it out. A message from Guillaume. She opened it and stared at his picture, at the man he used to be, and tears filled her eyes, hot and stinging. She fired back a reply, telling him that she would be home soon, and continued to stare at his photograph, using the anger and pain the sight of it stirred to bring more tears. Tears she intended to use against the bastard vampires. This was going to be the performance of her life. They wouldn't know it was all an act until it was too late for them. She clutched her left arm and sniffled as she shuffled towards the arched entrance, keeping her head bent and bumping against the wall from time to time in case they were aware of her. The weaker she looked, the better this would go for her. The vampires wouldn't think she was a threat if she looked close to passing out from blood loss and fear. More tears came as her phone vibrated, no doubt with a reply from Guillaume. He was weakening more each day now, running out of time. She frantically banged on the wooden door, letting her desperate need to save Guillaume get the better of her and color her actions. The voices on the other side grew hushed, and she waited, heart hammering in her throat as adrenaline surged, anticipation pushing her right to the edge. She breathed through it, calming her nerves and focusing on her act. She had to make it convincing. She banged again. "Help me, please. I heard voices in there. Please help me." Footsteps echoed on the other side of the door, and she tensed as it creaked open, revealing a handsome, fair-haired man. He frowned at her, his eyebrows pinching hard above his dark eyes, and looked her over. "What do you want?" he said in her tongue, his accent telling her that he was Catalan like she was, a local. How many other citizens of her city were vampires? They multiplied so fast she struggled to keep up with them. For every one that she killed, another 2 were made. "Please." She leaned towards him and peeled her right hand away from her arm, her brow furrowing as she revealed it to him. His nostrils flared and crimson ringed his irises. She pretended not to notice his reaction, swayed a little and pressed the back of her hand to her forehead as she slurred, "I was attacked. A man. I think he's still after me. I heard voices and thought you could help me. Please, help me. I'm afraid he's going to find me." The vampire's dark gaze drifted down to her arm as she wrapped her hand back around it, squeezing the wound beneath her leather jacket to tease more blood from it. That fiery corona rimmed his irises again, brighter this time as he stared, seemingly transfixed, completely under her spell. "What's going on?" Another male voice came from behind him, tugging him out of his reverie, and he looked over his wide shoulders at his comrades. She peered past him while he was distracted, quickly scanning the elegant courtyard and the arches that surrounded it on the ground floor where the building was set back a few feet on all sides, forming a covered walkway. The trio of vampires standing there eyed her, a flicker of hunger in their gazes as they took her in. The blonde nudged the dark-haired man and slid him a look, one that sent a shiver of disgust rolling down her spine. He thought her easy prey. He was going to find out how wrong he was about that soon enough. "I'm sorry to have bothered you." She went to turn away, but the vampire at the door grabbed her arm, the pressure of his grip firm enough to have the nerve she had tamped down rising back up again. She shook it off. All vampires were strong. They were fast, too. But they had a vulnerability that evened the playing field. They were highly allergic to silver. It had sickened her the first time she had killed one with her sword and watched as the silver it contained had corroded flesh and bone, causing it to fizz and hiss as it melted. Now she was used to it. "Come in, until the danger passes. You'll be safe here." He smiled, revealing straight white teeth with no hint of fangs. She wasn't the only one who was good at acting. The shimmer of red in his eyes said that he wanted her blood, and the way he cast a black look at his comrades warned he didn't want to share. If provoked, would he fight his own friend so he could be the only one to taste her vein? She filed it away as a backup plan, one she wasn't going to need. He ushered her inside, all charm and warmth as he continued to smile at her. He shut the door, the heavy thud of it closing an ominous sound she tried not to interpret as a death knell. She shuffled along beside him, casting fearful glances back over her shoulder from time to time for good measure. The door was closed, but it didn't look as if he had locked it. That was good. If things went south, escape might be possible. A fifth vampire strode from a corridor off to her left and paused, his gaze immediately settling on her. "What do we have here?" "I was hurt," she started. "We're going to take good care of her." The man holding her arm smoothed his hand along it, upward towards her wound, a faint crimson glow lighting his eyes as he looked down into hers. "You will feel better before you know it." She nodded, certain that she would, as she casually slipped her right hand behind her and under her jacket. The blonde moved a step forwards, shadowed by the dark-haired man and the brunette. She shivered under the intensity of their gazes, sickened by the hunger that blazed in their eyes. As they looked at her as if she was a five-course meal they couldn't wait to devour. The fair-haired man edged closer. Katerina pulled her sword from her sheath and had it buried in his gut before he could react, ramming it up into his heart. He hissed and shrieked, his fangs long white daggers as she yanked her blade free and leaped back a step, placing some distance between her and the others. The vampire went down, clawing at his chest as blood soaked his t-shirt. She didn't watch as he crumpled into a heap, kept her eyes on the others as she circled them, tightly clutching her silver sword. She ditched her black leather jacket, tossing it as she assessed her enemies. It was easier to fight in just her black tank, and she had the feeling she was going to need the freedom of movement it gave her. The sound of footsteps on stones filled the thick silence, alerting her to the fact that there were more than these 5 vampires in the nest. She braced herself, expecting them to come join the fight. Seconds stretched into what felt like hours as she faced off against the remaining 4 vampires. The others didn't appear. Things were looking up. The blonde and the brunette vampire moved to flank her, and she did her best to keep her focus split between all of them, aware that even a slip in it would be her downfall. The dark-haired male remained in front of her, together with the other one. He licked his fangs. Katerina narrowed her eyes on him, silently showing him that this wasn't going to go down the way he thought it was. The smoldering pile of vampire remains on the flagstones to her left was testament to that. She yelled to unleash the pent-up rage inside her and spun, digging the heel of her thick-soled leather boots into the paving as she brought her blade around in a low arc. She grasped the hilt of the sword with both hands as she came to face the vampire nearest the exit and shoved forwards, burying the point of the silver blade deep into his chest before he could stop her. Katerina dropped hard as the air moved behind her, years of fighting honing her reflexes until they acted as an early warning system. The blonde vampire's fist arced where her head had been, and she swung her leg out, bringing it around in a low, sweeping kick. Her calf connected with the vampire's ankles, and she followed through, sending him slamming onto his back. She didn't stop. She used the momentum to propel herself upwards and brought her sword around at the same time, aiming it at the neck of the vampire she had stabbed in the chest. She hid her grimace as it sliced through his throat and scraped across bone, and she didn't pause to watch as the vampire slumped into a heap near the remains of the fair-haired one. Katerina twisted and ducked as the dark-haired vampire attempted to grab her, hurled herself forwards into a roll and came to her feet near the blonde. She kicked him to keep him down and faced off against the brunette. He snarled and flashed fangs, and she was quick to dodge when he slashed at her with his claws, ducking backwards and then to her right. His growls deepened, anger lacing them as she continued to evade him and jabbed at him with her sword, seeking an opening. He knocked her blade away each time. She lunged at him, determined to land a blow. He leaped back a step, brought his hand up to his mouth, and ran it across his fangs. What was he doing? Blood rolled down his hand, and he flicked it at her. She flinched away as it hit her in the face and cursed herself for letting him distract her. The blonde made the mistake of getting up. Katerina whirled to face him and stuck her blade in his gut. Excitement trickled through her as the number of foes dwindled to only 2, and she meant to leave the blonde to die from silver exposure, but couldn't stop herself from lashing out at him again, pulling her blade from his stomach and slashing across his thigh to deal another fatal blow. She knew it was a mistake the second she did it. The air shifted behind her, the dark-haired vampire little more than a blur even to her trained eyes as he moved like lightning. She tried to turn, her movements sluggish compared with his, time seeming to slow as panic spiked in her veins, sending another sharp burst of adrenaline into her blood. The vampire grabbed her hair, balling it in his fist, and yanked her head back so hard she saw stars. A cry burst from her lips as she bowed forwards, afraid he would break her neck, and the fear she had been denying roared up on her as he bent his head. A vicious growl pealed around the courtyard. She froze as ice skittered down her spine in response to that feral sound, the fear she had felt of the vampire growing tenfold as the man stilled behind her and the other vampire looked towards the arched exit. Katerina looked there too. Another vampire returned to join in the fight? The darkness itself seemed to shift before her eyes, the ground quaking beneath her boots as the shadows suddenly parted to reveal the dark visage of a formidable warrior, as he barreled towards her and the vampire. Silver flashed in his hand as his eyes narrowed on the man holding her, and the vampire came to his senses. He spun with her, using her as a shield. Her eyes widened as the newcomer threw his hand forwards, letting the silver knife he held fly. It came right at her as she flinched, sure this was it and her life was over. The vampire behind her shrieked and staggered backwards, tugging her with him as he tripped across the courtyard. Heat bloomed on her neck and shoulder, the sickening stench of blood filling her nostrils and the bubbling hiss telling her what had happened. The warrior had better aim than she had expected. She wrenched free of the vampire and spared him a glance as he went down, clutching the knife protruding from his forehead. The dark-haired warrior grabbed her arm and shoved her backwards behind him. He planted a heavy boot against the fallen vampire's chest, gripped the hilt of his weapon and pulled it free, the sucking sound sending bile blazing up Katerina's throat. "Keep back!" The warrior's gravelly voice rolled over her, a pleasant belly-heating timbre to it as he moved to face the final vampire. It distracted her enough that it took her a moment to realize something. He was shielding her from the vampire, and he meant to fight the bastard alone. She rallied and shirked his grip, because she was damned if that was happening. This was her nest of vampires. The final kill was hers to make, and if he stood in her way, she would cut him down too. Chapter 3. The last thing Marek expected as he stared down the brunette vampire was the woman wrenching free of his grip and storming past him. It surprised him enough that it took him a moment to realize what she was doing. She spat a vicious curse in the Catalan tongue and raised her sword as she bore down on the vampire. Marek couldn't blame the male for looking as stunned as he felt. Blood flecked her face and drenched her sword, rolled from the places where she had been caught by more than one set of claws, and her hazel eyes were bright with the high of battle. She was a formidable sight for such a slender, petite creature. The vampire shook himself out of his stupor just as the woman reached him and dodged left, leaving her on a collision course with one of the pillars supporting the overhanging floors above the courtyard. She slammed her left hand into it and pivoted, using the momentum to her advantage as she pushed off, muscles flexing beneath her golden skin. Marek leaped into the fray with her, partly because she needed his assistance with this vampire because Marek could sense he was stronger than the others she had managed to dispatch, and partly because he wasn't about to let her steal his quarry. The vampire spotted him and put on a burst of speed, appearing behind Marek, closer to the door. He meant to escape. It wasn't going to happen. The woman noticed his intent, too, and turned on a pinhead to track the vampire, almost losing her footing in the process. Marek beat her to the male, using his own preternatural speed to cut him off before he could reach the door. The vampire almost barreled into him, saving himself at the last second by backpedaling hard, his arms flailing as he fought for balance. A flash of victory shone in the woman's eyes as she came up behind the vampire, and Marek couldn't contain the growl that rolled up his throat as he realized he had driven the vampire right into her arms. She gripped her sword with both hands and brought it up in a fast, brutal arc. The vampire bellowed as he arched forwards, blood spraying from above his shoulder, as the blade swept upwards, delivering a vicious blow that was sure to be his end. She swore again in Catalan, a not very complimentary curse about the vampire's mother, and spun on her heel as Marek watched, too enthralled by the bewitching beauty to move as she sang a siren song to his heart. It was hard not to find her alluring when she was doing his favorite pastime with so much grace and fire. It was hard not to find her arousing. The heat of battle was no place to be feeling pleasure from anything other than breaking bones, severing arteries, and claiming heads. But it was hard not to feel it as he watched her decapitate the vampire. Blood splattered over Marek's chest, but he didn't notice, was too enchanted by how fire lit her eyes as she came to a halt, breathing hard. That delicious high of victory painted all over her face so vibrantly that he swore he could feel it, knew exactly what she was experiencing as she held her blade out at her side and watched the final vampire fall. God's damn, she was incredible, but also infuriating. "That was my vampire," he said, voice a low growl that hid none of his fury as he looked down at the bubbling, smoking corpse between them. "This whole nest was mine." She was swift to ready herself for a fight, bringing her sword down in front of her and bracing her feet apart. His heart beat a little harder, that wicked sort of heat she stirred in his veins burning hotter as she faced him, looking for all the world as if he was next on her dance card. He wanted to be next on it, But the sort of dancing his body wanted wasn't the kind she had dealt these vampires. He wanted to tangle with her, ached for it. He had seen strong women before, Valen's beloved Eva being one of them, but they were rare, and this female was a jewel among them, shining brightly and beckoning him. He wanted to possess her, and that made her infinitely more dangerous than the rest of her kind. "So what?" she spat in heavily accented English, her chin jerking up as her features set hard, soft pink lips flattening and fine eyebrows drawing down over her bright hazel eyes. "You should have beat me to them then. Don't cry to me because you weren't quick enough and I bested you." He raised an eyebrow at her as his blood heated another 10 degrees. "Bested me?" He almost growled, but then the irritating voice of reason chimed that she had beaten him to the kills. He wasn't going to let it slide that easily, though. "There were a dozen vampires in this nest." He cast a glance around the bloodbath in the courtyard, carnage that the woman stood in the middle of, a vision of crimson-splattered beauty. He tried to ignore the fresh bolt of hot lust that rushed through him on looking back at her. "I count only 5 bodies." She swept her blade to her right, sending the remaining blood on it flying to the pavement, and slipped it into the sheath he had noticed strapped to her back. Did she no longer consider him a threat? Her second mistake of the evening. Just because she was human didn't mean she was safe from his wrath. "I'll find the rest," she snarled as her pretty face darkened. "I'll scour the damned city until every last one of them is like that." She nodded her head towards the vampires decaying between them, now little more than a bubbling pile on the paving slabs. "I don't think so." Marek flexed his fingers around the worn leather hilt of his blade, and her gaze flickered there. Her right hand inched behind her hip, edging towards the grip of her sword. She didn't need to worry. He wasn't going to attack her, but he wasn't going to let her have her way either. "You already killed enough of my vampires." And the hunger he had hoped to sate was still riding him hard, unsatisfied by the single kill he had managed. He needed to find the others and deal with them, needed the high of battle that she was experiencing, the high she had stolen from him. She huffed and planted her hands on her hips. "I didn't see your name carved on them. They're mine, and you need to back off." "That isn't going to happen," he growled and took a single step towards her. Her right hand shot to the hilt of her sword, but she didn't draw it. He stared her down, aware that the darkness was rising in his eyes again, provoked by his need to hunt, by the frustration now mounting inside him as he looked at the aftermath of the fight and could count only one of the kills as his own. The 5 vampires might have satisfied him. Maybe. Probably not. It was taking larger and larger nests to keep his need to hunt the vermin quiet these days. If he could track down the remaining 7, it might at least take the edge off. He just needed to make sure the woman didn't get ideas about hunting them, so he had a clear shot at them without worrying about her. "You were almost killed tonight." He risked another step towards her and tried to keep the bite out of his voice, as a replay of her held in the arms of that damned wretch flashed across his mind, his fangs poised to pierce her throat. Darkness rose within him again, and he didn't tamp it down this time. Let it flood his veins and his eyes so she would see it, so she would know what she was up against. "You're not strong enough to fight that many vampires alone. It's tantamount to committing suicide. Do you have a death wish?" Anger flared in her hazel eyes, fire that stoked the one in his veins as he realized she was going to fight him on this. He wanted to tangle with her, just not in this way. If she wanted to fight, though, she had it. "I'm not afraid of death." The look in her eyes warned she meant that and told him that he wasn't the only one who had a reason to kill vampires. She was driven by something, and from where he was standing it looked personal. She stooped and grabbed a leather jacket from the ground, tugged it on in a way that screamed of the anger and frustration he could sense in her. Her eyes met his, and she cast him a withering glare that let him know exactly what she thought of him, and then stormed past him. He grabbed her arm, holding her back. "Where do you think you're going?" She yanked free of his light grip, tilted her head back, and glared up at him. "I'm going to find the vampires." "You won't find them tonight. They will have gone to ground. It's going to take us a few nights to uncover the location of their new nest." Her eyebrows shot up. "Us?" He hiked his shoulders, cleaned his knife on his combat trousers, and sheathed it. I'm not going to let you hunt them alone. Partly because she would get herself killed, mostly because he needed to kill them himself. Working with her seemed like a good way of getting her out of his way. Once they found the vampires, he could teleport her somewhere safe and return to kill them. She would be furious with him, but he found he liked that idea. He liked it when there was a bite in her tone and fire in her eyes. "No one lets me do anything." She looked as if she wanted to hit him. "I'm not yours to control. I can find the vampires without you. I don't need your help." He scoffed. "Is that so? Because from where I'm standing, I have the feeling I have at least 2 centuries of vampire hunting experience on you, and I know every inch of this city in detail. Can pin down at least a dozen locations I would check tomorrow night alone. Can you say the same?" Her mouth flapped open and snapped closed. She was quick to recover and hit him with another glare that let him know exactly what she thought about him. If he was trying to get that spot on her dance card for a midnight tango, he was going about it the wrong way. Something about her made it impossible to play nice, though. He had charmed his share of women over the centuries, could normally have them under his spell with only a few well-placed compliments and a little light flirting. Something about her had him way off his game. He didn't mean to be caustic with her, to push her buttons and rile her at every turn, but he couldn't help himself. And he had the feeling it wasn't because he didn't want to share the vampire kills. His mind whirled back to when he had first set eyes on her and the black, terrible need that had gone through him in that moment. A dark urge to protect her. He felt it even now, even as she leveled a black look at him, her eyes relaying the internal war she waged as she considered his offer. Despite the fact she clearly preferred working alone, just the fact she was considering it didn't sit well with her. He could see that much. He couldn't deny that it sat well with him. A little too well. The thought of working with her, seeing her again, had need rolling through him. Not a desire to tangle with her, but a desire to peel back her layers and discover what she hid beneath her beautiful, tough exterior. Why did she hunt vampires? He wanted to know the answer to that question. The corners of her lips turned downwards and she looked away from him. "Fine, but only because it will speed things up." Marek held his smile back, keeping his features flat and emotionless, so she couldn't see how much that pleased him. He gazed down at her, tracing her profile as she gently brushed her caramel-colored hair over her shoulder, causing the tumbling waves to catch the light and become threaded with gold. Her eyes slowly slid to meet his, stirring that wicked need in his veins again, quickening his pulse as he drank his fill of his enchanting vampire slayer. He wasn't sure this was a wise idea. Duty waged war with desire inside him, the sensible side of him filling his head with everything that had happened over the last few months. How the threat from their enemies was mounting now. Taking his eye off the ball could prove fatal. Every battle-hardened instinct he possessed drilled that into him. But another instinct pushed back against it, one that he had possessed from birth. An instinct she had awoken in him. Not the vampire slayer, but the vampire who had betrayed him. He didn't miss the irony of that. A vampire had awoken the dark, possessive side of his blood, had made him wild with a need to protect her and claim her as his forever. And she had killed that side of him, too, through a single act of betrayal. Now a vampire hunter had roused that instinct, breathing new life into it, and the fires of its rebirth felt as if they might consume him. Completing his hunt without her was the most sensible course of action, but he couldn't do it. The side of him she had awoken needed her with him, where he could see her, so he knew she was safe. If he didn't meet her and hunt the vampires with her, there was a chance she would go off alone and do something as crazy as spilling her blood again to attract the vampires. He touched her left arm, grazing his palm down the leather over the wound beneath it. Her eyes leaped to his face, and awareness of her narrowed the world down to only her, until she was all he could focus on. Maybe keeping her safe wasn't the only reason he wanted to hunt with her. He lifted his gaze to her face. A hot bolt of lightning struck him as their eyes met. He wanted her, and nothing in this world, the underworld, and all of Mount Olympus would stand in his way. Darkness curled through his veins, sank tendrils into his heart, and threatened to pull a growl from his lips. He would have her. Chapter 4. The fight had shaken her more than usual. Or maybe it was the mysterious warrior who stood before her that had her legs feeling weak. Katerina tried to tear her eyes away from his rich, earthy ones, eyes that had been black more than once during the fight and during their confrontation. He moved with the speed and fought with the strength of a vampire, but whatever he wasn't one of their breed, and he wasn't human like her. According to him, he was older than 200 years, something that might have sounded ridiculous or even incredible to her a decade ago. Now she felt nothing, no sense of amazement, no desire to laugh in his face and tell him his joke was poor. If vampires were real, then it stood to reason that there were other things that went bump in the night. What was he? A natural predator for the vampires? He evidently enjoyed hunting them, had been aggravated by the fact he had found her killing a nest he had earmarked for himself. He had seemed annoyed about offering to team up with her, even when it had been his suggestion. In all her research, she hadn't heard of vampires having any predators. Everyone painted them as the top of the food chain, the great white shark of the immortal world. She looked the man over. Where did he stand in that shadowy secret world? His fingers grazed her arm up and down, a maddening caress over her jacket that seemed to reach beyond the leather, so she could feel his touch on her bare flesh. Her breaths came shorter and faster even as she steeled herself against the effects of his stroking. She lifted her eyes to his, a demand to stop rising to her lips. It fell away as she fell into his eyes. They brightened, mesmerizing flecks of warm gold emerging against the earthy backdrop as they sparkled at her in the low light. Heat swept through her, a wildfire that frightened her. She had been so focused on her brother for the last decade that she hadn't been with a man in that time, hadn't even thought about indulging in such a thing. Now she couldn't think about anything else. This dark warrior had stolen the whole of her focus, had her breathless and aching for him to do more than lightly caress her arm over her jacket. She wanted to feel his fingers on her bare flesh, ached with a need to have his large hands cupping her, kneading her, teasing her to the edge of insanity. She swallowed to wet her parched throat and somehow found the strength to step back and break contact with him. Her voice wobbled as she spoke, betraying how easily he shook her. "I'll meet you in the Plaza Real tomorrow night at dusk." Meeting in a very public square seemed like the most sensible course of action. Something about this man unsettled her, and it wasn't just how easily he had her aching for his touch. She intended to question him before they went anywhere, learning more about him to set her mind at ease, something she couldn't do right now. She needed time to gather herself and build a wall, something to protect herself. He had her shaken, made her weak in a way she didn't like. She took a step towards the exit and looked back at him. "I'll give you an hour, but no more. If you don't show, I'm out of there." He nodded. "Until then." Katerina went to turn away from him, expecting him to follow her out of the building. He disappeared in a swirl of black smoke, and she stumbled backwards, her spine hitting the wall of the arched entrance as her breath left her in a startled rush. She stared wide-eyed at the lingering ribbons of darkness as they dissipated, cursed low in Catalan. What the hell? Her legs threatened to give out, and she leaned more heavily against the sandstone wall for support, struggling to comprehend what had just happened. Warning bells jangled in her head. She tried to ignore them as she found the strength to walk out of the heavy wooden door and close it behind her, concealing the carnage on the other side. There was more to the Dark Warrior than she had expected, and she didn't like it. For the last 9 years, she had known what she was up against, had learned everything about her quarry so they couldn't surprise her, catching her off guard. Now she had proposed working with a man she didn't know, one who had finally managed to stun her by revealing a power that did seem impossible, laughable, a very poor joke. He could teleport. She tried to wrap her head around that as she walked from the scene of the crime, heading towards the nearest metro station. Walking felt good, had her legs growing stronger beneath her and her head clearing, although she couldn't shift the warrior from it, or how easily he had unnerved her. What other powers did he have? She cursed again. Walking away from all of this was a good idea. Probably the best one she'd had all night, before she ended up in deep trouble. So why couldn't she do it? Katerina pondered that as she exited the narrow, sloping shopping street into a small square with a busy road running through it, and crossed it to the metro station. Every moment with the warrior played on repeat in her head, every detail pored over, every instinctive reaction he had triggered studied. Her attraction to him was obvious, and she wasn't foolish enough to deny that it existed. But her instincts also labeled him as dangerous as the vampires, perhaps even more so. Vampires she knew how to handle. This warrior tied her in knots, had her pulled in too many directions, and she didn't like it. She boarded a train and managed to find a seat thanks to the late hour. Lost herself in thought as she waited for her stop deep on the outskirts of Barcelona, far beyond the tourist attractions that crowded the center. Not meeting him wasn't an option. He knew the city and he wouldn't be deterred from hunting the vampires. Neither would she. Their paths would cross before the week was out, and another confrontation would happen. Angering a man with unknown powers was probably a bad thing. It was better to go along with her original plan, presuming he showed tomorrow night, and learn as much about him as possible before they embarked on their hunt, although she doubted he would enjoy a light round of interrogation. She left the train and walked home, enjoying the quietness of the streets and how the air was finally cooling, the vicious grip of summer easing on the city for a few scant hours before dawn came and had everyone boiling in their skin again. She loved her city, but hell, she hated it in summer. It was oppressively humid, the sun sending stifling air rolling in from the sea that bordered Barcelona, and the nearby mountains trapping it over the city. It was little wonder a lot of stores and businesses closed up for the hottest months, and many families headed to cooler destinations. Sometimes she and Guillem did that, picking another city in Spain as their base of operations for August, when the heat really hit. Vampires lived everywhere. There wasn't a city in the country where she couldn't find at least a few to hunt and eradicate. She pushed the door to her apartment building open and headed up the stairs, keeping her footsteps light so she didn't disturb the neighbors. When she reached her apartment door on the third floor, she pressed her ear against it and listened. It was quiet on the other side, no sign that Guillem was awake. He had been sleeping more and more recently, and it worried her. She slid her key into the lock and eased the door open, trying to make as little noise as possible so she didn't wake him if he was asleep. He needed his rest. If she woke him, he would spend hours questioning her, and he might even argue with her. She didn't want that. She had argued enough for one night. She silently closed the door behind her, removed her boots and socks, and padded barefoot across the living room, heading to her left past the kitchen towards her room. Guillem's room was beside hers. Their beds stood against the same wall, but not their bathrooms. Hopefully, she wouldn't wake him as she washed the grime of battle off her. She needed a long, hot soak. Her bedroom door creaked softly as she opened it, and she flinched, waiting, holding her breath. No sign of her brother came from the other room. She breathed a sigh of relief and stepped into her room, went straight to the bathroom on her left, and stripped off her jacket. Long grooves darted across her chest near her left collarbone, and she frowned as she inspected them. They were already healing. She didn't remember any of the vampires landing a blow on her, but then in the heat of battle she rarely noticed her injuries. The sting of them didn't register at the time, and everything happened so fast when fighting vampires. All of her focus was on surviving. It was only in the quiet aftermath that she grew aware of any bruises and cuts, and how close she had danced to death. Her legs turned to noodles beneath her, and she gripped the sink on the vanity unit, clutching it for support as she breathed through the crushing wave of panic. She was alive. She was fine. She cursed herself, how things always went like this, even though she did her best to grow stronger, to overcome the debilitating onslaught of feelings that happened whenever she was home safe after a hunt. Nothing she did stopped it from happening. She stripped off the rest of her clothes, closed her bathroom door, and stepped into the shower cubicle. Katerina hissed in a breath as she switched on the water, and a frigid blast of spray hit her. She shrank back, waiting for it to warm, holding herself as she willed it to hurry. She needed the soothing heat of the shower to wash away her burgeoning fear. It was ridiculous to feel it now when she was safely locked in her apartment and the vampires were dead, but it always surged through her. a delayed reaction to the battle that she couldn't hold back. The water heated and she stepped beneath the jet, tipped her head back, and closed her eyes as she let it hit her face. A sigh escaped her as the hot water ran over her face and down her shoulders, stinging the cuts on her chest and the one she had made on her arm. The fear swelling inside her reached a crescendo, and she let it come. Let it wash over her just as the water did, and let the water carry it away. Time slowed as her entire world narrowed down to just breathing. In, out. She was safe. The vampires were dead. The hunt would continue, and for once she wouldn't be alone out there walking the dark streets, fighting to keep them safe and to save her brother. The warrior would be with her. A soft knock at the door shattered the image of him building in her mind. "Katerina?" Guillaume's gentle voice rolled over her like the water to carry away her fear. He sounded stronger today. Had he been able to get some rest? Or were his spirits on the rise again? She hoped it was both. She hated seeing him so worn down and tired all the time. He rapped his knuckles against the door again. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she hollered over the noise of the shower. "I'll be out in a minute." Because she needed to see him, needed to see he was doing better tonight, and wanted to tell him about the warrior, about the hope she had. She shut the water off, stepped out of the shower, and grabbed her dove-gray robe from the back of the door. She hastily donned it and tied the belt around her waist, cinching it tightly before she opened the door. Guillaume wasn't there. Katerina snagged a towel and rubbed her hair with it as she walked through her bedroom to the main living area. Guillaume lounged on the couch, his black jeans and faded gray t-shirt baggy on his ravaged frame now, when once they had fitted him perfectly. Her throat closed, eyes stinging as she looked at him, as he turned his head towards her and smiled at her over the back of the brown leather couch. That smile didn't reach his hazel eyes. They had been bright once, like hers. Now they were dull, constantly laced with fatigue and pain. Fatigue and pain that she wanted to take away. Would take away. She took the seat beside him on his right as he flicked channels, twisted to face him, and brushed her fingers through his dark hair, sweeping the overlong strands of it from his face. She would have to trim it for him soon. If she left him to his own devices, it would be down to his backside by now. He needed to take better care of himself. "I met someone tonight, and I think he can help." She paused with her fingers against the side of his head as he finally looked at her again, taking his eyes off the screen of the television to her right. "He?" Guillaume's face darkened and the tightness in her throat increased as she saw a shadow of her brother, of the way things had been before he had been turned. He never had liked her talking about men. His need to protect her ran as deep in his blood as her need to protect him. "He knows vampires. I took out a nest of them with his help." She left out a few details, like the fact the warrior had saved her. Guillaume didn't need to know how close she had come to losing her life tonight. She had made the mistake of telling him everything in the early days, and it had always upset him, and led to arguments. He didn't want her to go hunting vampires for his sake. She didn't care. She had to do it. For him. "I'm going to meet him again tomorrow night to hunt some that got away. I'll question him while we look for them. I really think he can help, Guillaume." She brushed another rogue strand of dark hair from his face. It had been as light as hers once, kissed by the sun. Now it was verging on black. The result of his sickness? She had never heard of it changing the color of a vampire's hair. But then she hadn't exactly stopped to question any of the ones she had slain to find out all the details about their transformations. It was possible their hair changed color, darkening to suit a creature of the night. Maybe the rest of them dyed their hair. Maybe Guillaume's was because he had never fed. The same reason he was weakening, slowly fading as the years went on without her finding a cure for him. How much longer did he have before her inability to save him ended up killing him? She shook that question away because if she thought about it, the hope she was trying to hold on to would fade, just as he was, and she would slip back into depression. It was a daily struggle to keep that dark beast from her door. She wouldn't surrender to it again. Guillaume needed her out on the streets, searching for his sire so she could kill it, not holed up in her room trapped in her bed by a crippling disease. I don't like the idea of you meeting with this man again. Who is he? Guillaume's eyes narrowed, the dullness finally leaving them as a flicker of fire lit them. It had been so long since she had seen anything other than resignation in his eyes that she wanted to cry. She squashed that urge and took hold of his hand, running her fingers over the bony back to soothe him. It didn't smooth the sharp edge from his voice as he frowned at her. Is he a vampire? No, never. I'd never work with one, and you know that. He was hunting them. He's something else. I don't know. I'll find out tomorrow. She squeezed his hand and smiled. And I'll be careful. You know me. I never do anything rash. She did rash things all the time, like cutting herself to lure vampires into a false sense of security. She just didn't tell her brother about them. It was better he didn't know. She hated arguing with him, although she could see one building in his eyes as he stared at her in stony silence. I'll be careful. I'm not going to leave the Plaza Real until I know more about him. If I get a bad feeling, I'll leave. All right? She hoped it was enough to ease Guillaume's worry, because it was all she could offer him, and she had doubts that she would actually go through with leaving the warrior and the hunt behind, even if she did get a bad feeling about him. She needed his help, because she needed to kill those vampires, and she had the feeling he was the fastest way to find where they were hiding now. I could go with you. You shouldn't go alone. Guillaume's tone brooked no argument. It didn't stop her. We're meeting at dusk. It's too dangerous for you. It's too dangerous for you, he countered, his features darkening in a way that warned they were going to argue if she let things continue. I'll be careful. I won't move a step from the square without being sure of him and that I can trust him. And if I feel anything is wrong, I'll head to the nearest police officers. There's always some hanging out there to keep an eye on the tourists. She brushed her hand over his, drawing his focus down to it, and the hard lines of his face softened at last. He sighed and then reluctantly nodded. She squeezed his hand again, gently so she didn't hurt him. I know you worry about me, but I worry about you. He knows vampires, Guillaume. He knows how to kill them, her brother countered, the bite still in his voice. I'm sure he knows more than that. I don't know what he is, but he's part of the same world as the vampires. As you. She hated herself for saying that, wanted to take it back straight away as Guillaume looked away from her, his gaze strained to the window to the left of the TV. He didn't need her reminding him of what he was, not when he was so weak, liable to head out into the night and do something rash. She wasn't the only one who had inherited their father's recklessness. Just let me meet with him. I'm confident he can help. Not a lie. The more she thought about the mysterious warrior, the more confident of that she became. He hunted vampires, sure, but that meant he knew the breed. He was part of their world, granting him access to information that was beyond her reach. If anyone could help her save Guillaume, it was him. She just had to tap into that knowledge without revealing that her brother had been turned. Because the warrior hunted vampires, and the darkness that had been in his eyes at times left her feeling that he made no exceptions. She looked at Guillaume, filled with hope again as she thought about tomorrow, about the knowledge she might gain and how close it might bring her to saving him. None of that hope was reflected back at her in Guillaume's eyes. They grew cold, hollow almost as he stared at her, and she could see him withdrawing, closing himself off from her again. She tightened her grip on his hand, desperate to keep him with her even as she knew it was impossible. Whenever he changed like this, all she could do was cling to the hope he refused to have for his sake. One of them had to hold on to it. One of them had to remain strong, or both of them would give up. It was hard with the weight of the last 9 years on her shoulders, constantly threatening to break her, testing her strength at every step. But she wouldn't break. She wouldn't, because she couldn't lose her only family. For a moment, Guillaume looked as if he wanted to say something, but then he slipped his hand from hers and stood. Her heart wrenched into her throat as he looked over her head at the door, and the distance between them yawned like a chasm, cold and forbidding, threatening to rip all hope from her. Guillaume, she whispered, silently pleading him to stay with her. He looked down at her and offered her a soft smile as he ruffled her hair. I won't be gone long. I won't bite anyone, Katerina. That smile gained a sorrowful edge as he rounded the couch and she twisted on the seat to track him. He opened the door and murmured, My fangs never seem to work anyway. Hope began to deflate as the door closed behind him and she sank against the back of the sofa, the brown leather creaking under the pressure as she settled her chin on the top of it. She clung to it, refusing to give up as Guillaume had. Things were looking up, even if he couldn't see it, was so tired and jaded by the last 9 years that it was impossible for him to find even a sliver of hope in what she had told him. The warrior could help them. She hoped. She stared at the closed door, aching inside as cold swept through her together with a feeling that had her blood turning to icy sludge in her veins. If he couldn't, she was going to lose her brother forever, and she would follow him into the endless night. Chapter 5. Marek shoved his dark brown linen trousers down and stepped out of them, picked them up and neatly folded them. He set them on the bed beside his combat gear and paused to stroke them, feeling the heat of the sun on their fibers. It had gone down almost 20 minutes ago, and the sunset had been glorious from the covered patio of his villa high on the hills above Seville. Golden light had kissed the entire valley, making the dusty ochre soil glow and bringing out the green in the olive trees. Birds had sung, insects had joined them. Peace had invaded every fiber of his being, despite how aware he was of what the sunset meant. Dusk was coming. He had spent the entire day thinking about the woman. He should have asked her for her name before stepping, a term he and his brothers used for teleporting, since it only took a single step to move a great distance. Getting her name was the first thing he intended to do tonight when he met her at the square in Barcelona. The second thing he intended to do was dig into why she hunted vampires. The more he knew about her before they started their hunt, the better. He preferred to arm himself with as much knowledge as possible, whether it was about his enemy or a new ally. He already knew she was reckless, and that she had been fighting vampires for some time, given the skill she had displayed during the battle last night. She had a fiery personality, and she didn't like strangers, or perhaps men in general, trying to control any aspect of her life. She was headstrong, determined, and, he had to admit, he found it more than a little alluring. A slow smile curled his lips as he tugged his black fatigues on, barely aware of what he was doing as his mind replayed how they had come to verbal blows. She had intrigued him before they had started their intoxicating dance, exchanging barbs and subtly testing each other, seeking out how dedicated the other was to their cause. He had concluded today that she was a force to be reckoned with, despite the fact she clearly didn't belong in his world. He had also concluded that she had felt that same spark as he had when they had touched, when he had been looking into her eyes in that dark archway. Heat had flushed her cheeks, and the scent of desire had laced the air, teasing his senses and strengthening the need he felt for her, as it provoked the side of him that had lain dormant for so long. The dark need to possess her hadn't faded during their time apart, although that might have something to do with the fact that when he had managed to catch some sleep on the patio in the sunshine, she had been the star in a very wicked dream. In it hadn't been the vampire behind her twisting those waves of delicious spun caramel around his fist, bending her to his will as he lowered his lips to her throat. Marek had been there, watching himself kiss her golden skin, watching the way pleasure flitted across her delicate features in response, how her breasts heaved with her quickening breaths and her lips parted on a blissful sigh. He cleared his throat and adjusted his cock as it stiffened painfully, palming it into a better position. It had been too long since he had slept with a woman, and far too long since he had wanted one this badly. It was a recipe for disaster. He needed to get his body under control, because she was sure as hell going to notice how much he wanted her if he didn't. His gaze strayed to the black t-shirt on the dark blue covers of his bed and then down at his groin. Maybe it was better he stuck with his black linen shirt. The tails were long enough that they covered his raging hard-on. It might spare him some embarrassment if he did fail to keep his cool around the woman tonight. although she would probably be able to see it in his eyes. He twisted to face the bathroom and risked a glance at the mirror above the vanity. His normally deep brown eyes glowed with golden and emerald flecks, a sign of his hunger, the desire that pulsed inside him, running like quicksilver through his veins to drug him. Desire wasn't the only thing that made his eyes shine like that. Anger did too. Could he make her believe it was anger or the thrill of the hunt, making his eyes change if she asked about them? A grimace tugged at his lips as he remembered that she had seen his eyes like this, when they had been in that strained moment in the arched entryway, both of them snared and held captive by the attraction that had blazed between them. Not a chance she would believe that had been anger. "Fuck. Maybe it's better she knows what it is," he muttered and turned away from the mirror. "Might work in my favor." She might help him scratch this itch he had for her. A midnight tango might be on the cards. He wanted her. What was the point in hiding that? It wasn't as if he was alone in his feelings. She wanted him, too. He started to grin, grimaced again when he felt a fierce tug in his chest. The gate. Not now. He flicked a glance at the clock on his bedside table. Did he have time to deal with the gate? Normally, he didn't mind when it called to him to do his duty, signaling that there was a hellspawn waiting to cross between this world and the underworld, or vice versa. Normally, he didn't have a date with a beautiful vampire slayer. He growled and pivoted, shoved his feet into his boots, and quickly laced them before striding out of the bedroom. He crossed the living room, his boots loud on the terracotta tiles as he banked right towards the dark cream couches and armchairs surrounding the unlit fireplace. He took another right as he reached them, shoving the door to his office open and swiftly closed the distance between him and the cupboards that lined the wall to his right behind his desk. The feeling came again, pulling at him, and he froze as something hit him. The tugging sensation wasn't drawing him in the direction of the active gate. It was pulling him toward that gate's twin, a gate that hadn't been used in centuries. "Shit," he growled, yanked the door of the nearest cupboard open and grabbed the silver and black circular medallion that was hanging on the brown leather and bronze shield mounted on the wall. He slipped it on and tucked it into his shirt. It had come out that the circular amulets weren't the key to opening the gates when their enemy had stolen the one belonging to his older brother Ares. Apparently, the keys of Hades were Marek and his brothers, their blood containing the power to control the gates. Right now, the enemy didn't know that, and he wasn't going to be the one to reveal it to them by forgetting to bring his amulet. Marek held his hand out behind him and focused. His mobile phone whipped into it from the desk behind him, and he brought it up in front of him, fired off a group message to his brothers about his suspicions, and pocketed it before he stepped. Darkness embraced him and then receded, revealing golden earth and olive trees that clung to a rocky hill that rose before him. Silence stretched around him, and he stilled, focused to sharpen his senses. Had he been wrong? The tug was still there, deep in his chest, but it was lighter now, and it wasn't pulling him towards the main Seville gate on the other side of the valley, closer to the city. It was definitely the smaller twin gate that wanted his presence. He followed the winding path up the hill to a bluff and scoured the land below, eyes charting everything in the fading light. The gate was down there, in a clearing among the sparse trees and brush. As far as he could tell, it was the only thing there. Was it possible a hellspawn was waiting on the other side for him to open it? He eased down into a crouch at the edge of a flat rock. He doubted it. His father, the god king Hades, never allowed anyone to pass through this gate. He had kept it inactive since Marek's only sister, the twin of his youngest brother Callistos, had been murdered. Upon discovering that he and his brothers were the keys of Hades, Marek had realized the reason there were two gates in Seville. One was bound to Callistos. The other would have been bound to Calindria. Now that she was gone, stolen from them, it was possible that Callistos had power over the gate, that the closeness of his blood would allow him to seal it if they had to go that route. It was a plan they had discussed more than once over the last few months, since their enemy had made itself known. The less gates they had to protect, the easier it should be. In theory. The problem was, the less gates there were to protect, the less gates there were to share the power that flowed between them, meaning the more dangerous and unpredictable they became. His oldest brother and self-appointed leader of their team, Karras, had decided that sealing any of the gates might prove catastrophic. Ares had agreed with them, and Escher hadn't been on board with the plan either. Marek and the others couldn't exactly argue when the oldest three of them were against it. He reached down and pressed his hand to the earth beside his right boot, closed his eyes and focused on it, connecting to his element to give his senses a boost in case he had missed something and demons were lying in wait at the gate. The call it had sent to him couldn't be caused by them. The gate responded only to hellspawn, demigods, and gods or goddesses. But that didn't mean this wasn't a trap. The enemy was strong. It was possible they had managed to get their hands on a hellspawn and had brought them to the gate to make it reach out to Marek. In fact, it was the only explanation that made sense. Although he didn't see a hellspawn in the vicinity either. Maybe he needed to take a closer look. He wouldn't get too close to the gate. That way it wouldn't manifest and be in any danger. He knew it well enough to be able to skirt the edge of it far away enough that he wouldn't trigger it, but close enough that he could get a good look. He stepped, landing to the right of the clearing. The olive tree in front of him wobbled and distorted. Weird. He blinked and shook his head. Teleporting shouldn't affect him. Heat haze? Marek? The female voice came from behind him, sent fire and ice shooting down his spine and had him spinning on his heel, shifting to face her in another disbelieving blink of his eyes. Erlia? He stared at the beautiful raven-haired female who stood before him, black diaphanous robes clinging to her curves, caressing the ample swell of her bosom and the tempting flare of her hips, cinched with silver at her waist. Her dazzling green eyes shone at him, sparkled like emeralds as she smiled, her sweet cherry lips curving gracefully and making his heart skip a beat. It wasn't possible. On the heel of the wave of lust and heat that surged through him came anger and hurt so vicious and deep, it sent him to his knees on the dirt. He clutched at the earth, growled and bore his emerging fangs at her as she tilted her head up and looked down her nose at him, as her smile turned wicked and cold, lips parting to flash fangs as sharp as his own. "You cannot be here," he snarled and dared to look at her again. The pain beating inside him grew 100-fold, morphing into an agony so fierce it stole his breath, as his past flashed across his eyes, 1,000 moments when he had been happy, in love. He struggled for air as he looked at her, as her expression softened again, ripping at the fragile remains of a heart that she had left in his chest after rending it apart with her claws. With her betrayal. An image of her standing on the elegant patio of a Georgian-style black mansion, illuminated by candlelight that chased over the creamy swell of her breasts and accented the delicate sweeps and lines of her face, rose before him. His heart beat harder in response, thundered against his ribs as need, love, and happiness poured through him. And then she laughed. Laughed in that way he would never forget, as the 3 male vampires beside her spoke of him, stabbed him deep in his chest and ripped his heart to shreds as she spoke of him. He didn't hear her words as he stared at her, the images flickering between the past and the present, the woman he had loved with every drop of his soul and the creature before him. "You're dead." He focused on the one in front of him, managing to shatter the vision of his past. He shook his head, clenched his teeth, and snarled at her as tears stung his eyes. "I fucking killed you." Or at least he thought he had. The night he had managed to hunt her down was always a blur for him, the faces of the vampires he had slaughtered blending together into one bloody stream as the darkness he always fought to hold back had seized total control of him. Was it possible she had survived? Erlia edged closer, her soft green eyes pulling him dangerously under her spell as she held a hand out to him. Gods, he wanted to take it. Frigid cold blasted across his back, rocking him forwards as dust swirled past him, and the longer lengths of his hair fell down to brush his brow. Erlia's robes didn't move at all. He frowned. Voices wobbled around him, watery and distant, and he couldn't make out what they were saying, but they were familiar. His brothers? Erlia leaned towards him, stretching her hand out to him. "Take it. Return to me." The agony boiling inside him reached a crescendo as he stared at her delicate hand, As his gaze flickered to her face and he saw the hope in her eyes, the love in them, his pain wavered and his resolve went with it. This was Erlia, his Erlia, returned to him. Escher suddenly went barreling through her, sending her spinning away from Marek. His older brother stumbled a few steps, his heavy worn black leather boots scuffing the ochre earth and sending dust up the blue jeans he wore tucked into them. He pivoted, the finger-length strands of his wild black hair falling down over his left eye, as wind blasted him from behind. His blue eyes leaped around, darkening by degrees as he searched for something. They settled on Marek and brightened, relief flooding them. "Whatever it is you're seeing, it's an illusion." Escher swiped his hand across his forehead and glared at his surroundings, a shadow crossing his features as he skipped right past Erlia as if she wasn't there. Because he couldn't see her. Marek cursed. Demon. The woman who had targeted Escher, desiring to turn him against his brothers and the entire human population of the world, had the power to create illusions so detailed it was almost impossible to tell they weren't real. Marek looked at Erlia as she strode towards him, fury turning her eyes crimson as her claws lengthened. She wasn't real. The Erlia he had known would never have asked for him to take her back. She had too much pride. And now that he knew this was an illusion, he could say with confidence that she had definitely died that night at the vampire stronghold. He hadn't left anyone alive. It had been a bloodbath. Another cold rush of wind battered him, and the sound of voices grew louder. "Snap out of it!" Escher grabbed his arm and hauled him onto his feet, his muscles flexing beneath the dark gray shirt he wore over a black t-shirt and causing the soft material to tighten across his arms and chest. Marek shuddered as his blood vibrated in his veins where his brother touched him, feeling as if it was going to explode. "Keep your head," Marek warned, his tone soft despite the gravity of his words. If Marek lost his head, things got ugly. If Escher lost his head, nothing survived. Escher frowned at him, and Marek was thankful that no trace of red shone in his brother's stormy blue eyes. Escher was in control, for now at least. Marek couldn't say how long it would last, not when they were fighting a powerful demon, and one who had managed to escape Escher's clutches. It would probably only take her landing a single wounding blow on one of his brothers to send Escher off the deep end. "We're all good here, Escher." Marek kept his voice even, calm. Diamond slapped him on the back so hard the air left Marek's lungs. "That's my line." Marek wheezed in a breath and realized that it wasn't only the force of his younger brother's slap that had knocked the air from him. The spot where Diamond had touched was icy cold, and his lungs ached as he dragged air into them. "Sorry." Diamond grimaced and scrubbed a black-gloved hand over the soft white tufts of his hair, his pale blue eyes backing up that apology. As he lowered his hand to rub at the neck of his long-sleeved navy roll neck, intricate patterns of ice glittered like diamonds on the black leather of his gloves. "You good?" Marek nodded, looked for Erlia. She was gone, and rather than an empty clearing, there were 10 demons and 2 more of his brothers. And the gate. A great twisting orb of fire swept past it as his older brother Ares hurled his hands forward, unleashing his power. It struck one of the demons, but the others were swift, easily dodging the attack. Marek wasn't sure what species they were. Right now, they appeared as human as he did, but there was a chance they had another form. Some were scaly and lizard-like beneath their human skin, and some could transform into beasts, and others resembled the images of vile horned and winged demonic creatures that humans equated with the word. Marek despised those ones most of all. Ares looked back over his wide shoulders, his tawny hair tumbling loose from the thong that held the top half of it back. "He good?" Marek was beginning to wish people would stop asking him that. "Think so," Diamond replied before Marek could answer for himself. "Got his illusion cherry popped so we get to interrogate him later about what he saw." The way Escher glared at Diamond, his eyes darkening dangerously, said that wasn't going to happen. Marek glared at him too, because he was damned if he was telling them anything about what he had seen. His past with Erlia was his business and his business alone. It was a joke. Sheesh. Diamond stepped, appearing beside Ares. The two of them joined forces, Diamond launching spears of ice at the demons to drive them back from the gate, as Ares formed a wall of fire around it to protect it. As much as Diamond and Aries fought and bickered, they were a formidable pairing. Escher looked down at Marek, and he could read what his brother wanted to ask him. "I'm fine." He dusted his knees off and huffed. "Give 'em hell." Escher grinned, flashing the sharp tips of his canines, but didn't rush off to join the fight. He casually lifted his left hand and curled his fingers into a soft fist. Behind him, 3 demons suddenly went down, convulsing violently. Diamond was quick to teleport. Aries wasn't so fortunate. Escher tightened his fist, and the 3 demons exploded, spraying black blood everywhere. Aries released a wave of fire, catching most of the blood before it could hit him, but the rest rained down on him, splattering his face and soaking into his t-shirt. He tossed Escher a black look as his jaw set hard, the muscles in it popping beneath his tanned skin. Diamond didn't miss a beat. He slowly raised his arms, his face etched with concentration as he reached deep below the dry earth with his power, drawing what moisture there was there to the surface. As his hands hit shoulder level, shards of ice shot up from the earth beneath 2 of the stunned demons. The demons shrieked and wailed as the glistening clear blue spears continued to rise upwards, as Diamond gritted his teeth and strained to draw more water up, lifting them high into the air, and fell silent as a dozen smaller spikes of ice suddenly burst outwards from the main shard, ripping them apart. Aries grinned and dodged as a demon came at him, clearly enjoying tangling with them as he kept them from the gate. Marek frowned as he realized the other brother he could sense hadn't moved. His gaze tracked right towards the gate, and he froze as it landed on Callistos. His youngest brother's blonde ponytail whipped around, the tails of his long black cotton coat flapping in the tempest that spun around him as he stared at the flat disk hovering a few feet above the earth in front of him. The dazzling, vibrant colors of it reflected in his eyes as the concentric, glyph-laden rings of the gate rotated lazily, flaring occasionally as it waited for a command. Marek's gaze leaped back to Aries. "You brought Cal? What the hell were you thinking?" That earned him a scowl from Aries. "It wasn't my damn idea." Aries broke away from the remaining few demons, leaving Escher and Diamond to deal with them. "You messaged all of us." Marek cursed himself for that. He hadn't been thinking. He should have been thinking. Callisto started shaking his head, slowly at first as Aries hurried to him, but he was frantic and clawing at his hair by the time Aries finally reached him, blasting straight through the gate and disturbing the concentric rings. Aries stepped the second he had Callistos in his grip, but Marek knew it was too late. By the time they landed wherever Aries was teleporting them, Callistos would have succumbed to the darkness of his past and the night they had lost his twin sister. And he wouldn't remember it or any of what had just happened. And it would kill him. "Damn it," Marek muttered beneath his breath, fury burning in his veins, all of it directed at himself. Callistos suffered enough as it was because of the amnesia. He didn't need his own brothers triggering it for him. Marek forced himself to focus on the gate as Diamond and Escher handled the remaining demons. If Aries and Diamond were a formidable pairing, then Escher and Diamond were a nightmare made flesh for any enemy that stood in their way. Escher preferred to use his power over water to make use of the abundant amount of it available in the cities when he fought. But here in the valley, the earth was baked dry from the summer heat, and it hadn't rained in more than a month. Not that it was a problem for Escher. He had developed a rather disturbing ability to command liquid in any form, and he liked nothing more than exerting that power on his foes. Another shriek pierced the night, and Diamond swept his hand across the air in front of him. A wall of ice shot up from the earth to protect him, blue one moment and black the next, drenched in foul demon blood. "Rein it in," Diamond snapped. "I won't forgive you if you get even a drop of that shit on me." "Rein it in?" Escher grinned. The skies suddenly opened, rain pelting the earth from a cloud that hadn't been there a moment ago, sending the scent of it into the air. Diamond smiled slowly. Over the demons, every drop of rain became a tiny ice spear. 2 of the demons tried to run, but there was no escaping the torrent as more clouds built above Marek, spreading to block out the stars as they started to emerge. Marek focused on the gate and watched as the concentric rings gradually slowed and the disk shrank, the colors losing their brilliance as each band disappeared. When it was the size of his fist, it disappeared with a violent purple flash that made him flinch. Silence suddenly fell around them, the rain ceasing as quickly as it started. The illusionist? Marek held the gate closed as he jogged over to his brothers to survey the dead demons. All of them were male and young. The enemy was recruiting. What had they offered these demons to make them willing to risk their lives by attacking a gate? The ranks of the enemy Marek and his brothers had fought in the past had revealed someone had offered them a slice of the realm that would exist if they succeeded in their plan to merge the underworld with the mortal one. Had these foolish demons been offered the same? Or had they merely wanted to go through the gate to the underworld? Many demons craved that, even though they had never set foot in that realm. None of them were old enough to have lived in the time before Hades had banished the demons from it after the last uprising. It didn't stop them from feeling as if the underworld was where they belonged, and where they should be allowed to live. While Marek understood why his father had banished them, he also understood why the demons felt the way they did. After all, Hades had also banished him and his brothers from the underworld after the Moirai had gone to him with their prediction about the gates and the merging of the two realms. If they succeeded, they would be allowed to return home. It had certainly motivated him and his brothers, even though it still stung to this day. Some of his brothers were less forgiving than he was. Valen still held a grudge against their father. Marek wasn't sure it would ever fade. "She isn't here," Escher barked and pivoted away from the remains of the demons. His deep voice grew as black as Styx. "She must have been here. Where the fuck is she?" "Maybe she cast her illusions from a distance?" Diamond offered, but Escher wasn't listening. He paced, turning the slick ground to mud as his boots churned the earth, clawing at his black hair as he stared at a spot only a few feet in front of those boots. Diamond went to move towards him. Marek held his hand out in front of him, not daring to touch his brother because he didn't want frostbite, but unwilling to let him disturb Escher. Their brother just needed a moment. He had been on edge for the last month, since the illusionist had escaped their grasp. He had probably been banking on recapturing her tonight. The contingent of demons she had brought with her had distracted them, keeping them busy while she had made her escape. Marek was furious about that too, but there was nothing he could do to change what had happened. "We will get another shot at her, Escher." He hoped it would soothe his brother and bring him out of his dark thoughts before they got the better of him and had him slipping into thinking about what had happened in Tokyo. Escher was handling it as best he could, but sometimes it was all too much for him. Watching Aiko die still haunted him, and whenever he allowed himself to remember it, he always lost control. And it always took her to bring him back to them. The world didn't know the level of catastrophe it had narrowly avoided that day. All three realms were lucky that Escher had managed to bring her back from the dead. Escher nodded, shoved his fingers through his black hair, and strode towards them. Diamond reached a hand out and hovered it over Escher's shoulder, keeping it from touching his dark gray shirt. The two of them had been close from the moment of Diamond's birth, and nothing could change that. Not even the fact that Diamond's power had manifested on Earth, affecting him physically. "What do you think their plan was?" Escher asked. Marek looked at the clearing where the gate had been. "I don't know, but we need to call a meeting." Chapter 6. Marek landed on the stone path outside the ancient Edo period mansion in Tokyo. Some of the tension instantly melted from his shoulders as he saw it, as he felt the new wards he and his brothers had put in place around the whitewashed walls trigger and cover him with their protective force. Ares was waiting on the porch, the slender light of the approaching dawn revealing him where he stood beneath the overhanging roof of the single-story traditional Japanese house. That same light caught on the gray glazed vertical ribs of the sweeping roof, drawing Marek's gaze up to the lightening sky. "Escher!" Aiko's soft voice, laced with desperation and relief, sounded so familiar now. A part of this place they all shared as brothers, as family, that a smile tugged at Marek's lips. Escher hurried past him, closing the distance between him and the petite raven-haired woman in only a few strides. He met her where she waited barefoot on the wooden deck of the porch in front of Ares and swept her up into his arms, burying his face in her neck for a moment before he kissed her. She brushed her fingers across the closely shaved sides of his head, and then pushed them into the longer black lengths of his hair on top as she kissed him softly. Ares muttered, "Get a room." Clearly, Megan wasn't attending the meeting. Ares was always cranky when he couldn't bring her with him. Valen appeared without his usual theatrics and without Eva. He took one look at Escher and Iko where they were still tangled in each other's arms and made a retching noise. Escher broke away from Iko's lips and scowled at him over his shoulder. Valen flipped him off. "If we aren't allowed to bring our ladies, I don't see why you get to have yours hanging around." "She lives here," Escher countered, his expression darkening as he released Iko and shifted to face Valen. "She lives here," Valen parroted in a high voice, sneering at Escher, his golden eyes as bright as the lightning he commanded. He pulled a face and stomped past Escher, nudging him aside so he could pull his boots off, toss them on the deck, and shove past Ares to enter the mansion. "Someone's pissy today," Diamond muttered. "Eva must be working." Valen always turned into a miserable, grouchy bastard when his little assassin was busy with work. Well, he turned into a more miserable and grouchy bastard anyway. Escher pulled Iko inside with him, and Marek met Ares' watchful gaze. "How is Callistos?" Marek approached the porch, stopped on the step, and removed his boots, neatly setting them down on the rack with his brother's ones. Diamond followed him. "Annoyed? Frustrated?" Ares folded his thickly muscled arms across his chest. "He blacked out?" Diamond paused halfway through untying his right boot and looked up at Ares. Ares nodded and swept the threads of his tawny hair from his face as he sighed. "I should have gotten him out of there the second he arrived. I never should have included him on the message. I wasn't thinking. I just wanted to get word out and get there to protect the gate." Marek offered Ares a tight smile when he looked as if he wanted to slap him on the shoulder, something that had become a habit when they had been in the underworld, but would probably set Marek's shirt on fire if he did it now. He peered past his older brother. "Is Karis here?" The grim face Ares pulled answered that question for him. "Still annoyed with me?" Marek was growing tired of the cold shoulder treatment. "I think he's cooling down at last. Just run away if she visits again, okay? You're not the only one who has to deal with him." Ares huffed, turned away, and strode into the mansion. "Not like I asked her to visit," Marek muttered. "Don't envy you." Diamond grinned as he passed, flashing straight white teeth. Marek used his powers to lift one of the pebbles from the carefully manicured front garden of the mansion and beam Diamond in the back of the head with it. Diamond glared over his shoulder at him and then smiled again. Maybe next time Ennio visited, he would step to Diamond's house in Hong Kong. That would wipe the smile off his brother's face. The golden tatami mats that covered the floor of the expansive, open-plan living area were rough beneath his feet as he entered the mansion, something he had always hated, but loved at the same time. It always felt good to return to the place they had once shared, before the world had begun developing at a rapid pace and his brothers had started finding places of their own. Only Escher lived here now, his duty to protect the Tokyo Gate and the city keeping him rooted in this mansion that their father had built with him in mind. Escher needed all the peace and tranquility he could get. Surviving his time in the mortal world was difficult for him, after everything he had been through at the hands of humans. Which was why it was so strange to see him settled on one end of the cream couches that formed a semicircle in the TV area to Marek's right, with a human tucked in his arms. Iko sat on his lap, fussing over the few cuts her man had managed to pick up from somewhere, possibly from attempting to penetrate the illusion the female demon had cast to weaken Marek. He would have to thank his brother for that later. He didn't want to think about what might have happened if Escher and the others had arrived any later than they had. The illusionist preferred to weaken her enemies with a vision from their past before attacking them, giving her the advantage as the illusion cloaked her from her victim's eyes. He might not have been standing here if it wasn't for Escher. Escher fussed over Iko in return, paying attention to only her, and Marek could see the struggle in his blue eyes as he tried to regain control of himself and his thoughts, shutting out the ones that might prove a trigger and might awaken his other side, the side that had been born in the bloody aftermath of what had happened to him centuries ago. Marek hadn't been aware of it before the night Calindria had been murdered. Escher had gone off the rails when they had found her body, and the underworld had suffered for it. Valen slumped into the seat between Iko's feet and Callistos, tipped his head back and sighed, causing his black t-shirt to stretch tight across his chest. He looped an arm around Callistos' neck, dragged him down, and scrubbed a hand hard across the top of his head. "Buck up." Valen wrestled with Cal as he fought him, trying to get free. The two of them had resembled each other closely until recently, when Eva had dyed Valen's hair a neon shade of violet. The long, bright strands hung over the left side of his face, leaving the right clear and revealing the puckered flesh that started low on his jaw and continued down his neck, the place where his favor mark had been before Zeus had forcibly removed it from him. Marek's own favor mark, the blessing of the goddess Gaia, warmed against his back in response to him thinking about it. He wasn't sure what he would do if he lost it. All of them valued their unique marks, and the favor of the god or goddess who had bestowed it upon them at birth. Although he wasn't sure how much Charis valued his, since Aphrodite had kissed his cheek as a babe and left a tiny black heart on it as his favor mark. Marek had lost count of how many times people had said it made Charis look girly, mostly because Valen said it at least once a week to provoke a reaction from Charis. Marek rounded the couch nearest the large flat-screen television that stood against the exterior wall of the house and sank onto it. Charis kept his profile to him, not even bothering to acknowledge him. Ares was wrong about him then. Charis was still angry with him. Marek cursed both Charis and Enyo. Charis needed to man up, grab hold of Enyo when she next visited and tell her how he felt, and then never let her go. His thoughts leaped to the beautiful vampire slayer. "Shit," he growled, gaining everyone's attention. He shrugged it off. "Just remembered something." "About the enemy in the gate?" Valen stopped attempting to drill a hole in Callistos' head with his knuckles, and both of them looked at him. No. I forgot something." "Like the oven being on?" Callistos managed to extricate himself from Valen's grip and glared as he untied his blonde hair, neatened it, and tied it back again. "I forgot that once. Charis ripped me a new one." Charis arched a black eyebrow at him. "Yeah, go ahead and pretend I didn't get a lecture on the dangers of leaving the oven on." Cal's blue eyes glittered at their older brother. The two were always a sharp contrast to each other. While Charis preferred to keep his black hair clipped short and neat, and wore impeccably pressed slacks and dress shirts with his fine Italian leather shoes, Callistos wore his hair long and paired form-fitting T-shirts, some of which had seen better days, with combat trousers and heavy scuffed leather boots. Charis had a refined air. Callistos was as wild and tempestuous as the wind he controlled. Youngest and oldest, the playful versus the most serious. Marek was 110% certain that Charis was just a clone of their father. Same ridiculously good looks, refined air, and haughty attitude. Both of them seemed to think the world should bow at their feet. Not that he was going to let either of them know he thought that about them. Charis would rip him a new one. "We are not here to discuss the time you cremated dinner." Charis twisted the silver ring on his right thumb, idly spinning it around with his fingers. "I'll start," Marek said, mostly because he wanted this meeting over with as soon as possible. Now he had remembered his date with the vampire slayer. A vampire slayer who was liable to leave without him if he didn't show soon. His leg twitched and he pressed down on it, stopping it from jiggling as he thought about her hunting the vampires alone. She would be vulnerable, in danger. She was probably in danger right that second. He needed to go. He needed to see that she had waited despite what she had said. He slammed a lid on that need. What he needed to do was his duty, and that meant finishing this meeting. He had never been one to shirk his duties, and he wasn't going to start now. He left that sort of thing to Valen, who excelled at it. "I felt the gate calling." He flicked a glance at Callistos to check on him. His younger brother's blue eyes were calm, so Marek continued, although he would keep an eye on him to make sure he wasn't going to cause another episode. "I sent the message and then I stepped. I surveyed the area from a distance and saw nothing unusual." "Because of the illusionist. The whole area was probably already an illusion of the real thing at that point." Escher petted Aiko, brushing his fingers through her hair as she settled against him, resting her head on his shoulder. "It would explain why the olive tree distorted when I stepped closer to the gate for a better look." Marek frowned as 1,000 questions formed in his head, and wanted to growl when he realized that he could probably only get answers to around 3 of them, if that. "Can this illusion affect senses like smell?" I should have been able to smell all of those demons. He should have been able to sense them. Demons caused a disturbing feeling in his gut, a swirling sensation that alerted him to their presence, together with the coppery odor of them. Escher nodded. It's not so much the world she's affecting, but your perception. That's how I see it. So she can strip us of our senses. That sounds like a bundle of fun. Valen snorted and then grinned, his golden eyes brightening dangerously. I want a shot at her next time. Reckon a little lightning up her arse will stop her from casting illusions. Someone had to protect the European gates. Karras's tone didn't brook any arguments. It never did. Valen looked at Escher. Swapsies next time. Come on, please. Think of it as an early birthday present. Escher flatly said, no. Attempting to get Escher to surrender a chance at getting his hands on the illusionist was like attempting to get his brother to go out and get chatty with the mortals. It was pointless because it wasn't going to happen. I'll take gate duties next time. You can have your shot at her, but you'll owe me. Diamond's pale blue eyes glittered like ice as he smiled in a way that said the favor Valen would owe him would be big. But then it's not a birthday present. Focus. Karras said the word calmly, his tone level, but he might as well have shouted it. Everyone fell silent and looked at each other like kids who had just been told off by their father, rather than men who had just been issued an order by their leader. Ares came up to stand behind Karras, backing him up. Get on with it. The fiery edge to his brown eyes said he wanted to hurry things along for the same reason Marek did. He wanted to see his woman. So how did the gate call me? Marek looked at each of his brothers in turn. They were demons at the gate, a gate that is closed to traffic. It shouldn't have called to me. It should have remained dormant. Valen scuffed a hand over his violet hair, pushing the longer lengths back before he stroked the roughly chopped short sides. The gate in Rome did something similar once, and I was ambushed by demons. And you are just mentioning this now? Karras leveled him with a look that was almost a glare, as close as Karras came to one. Valen shrugged. Didn't seem like much at the time. I fought the demons and figured the hellspawn who had been waiting for it had been scared off by them or maybe got bored waiting on the other side and left. It was a reasonable explanation for what had happened in Rome, where the gate was used regularly. But it didn't explain what had happened to the twin gate tonight. Diamond said what all of them were thinking, but none of them wanted to ask. Is there a chance there's more than only demons in our enemy's ranks? Marek really didn't want to consider that. Anything is possible. Karras spun the ring faster around his thumb, the action giving away his agitation even when his carefully schooled features and placid emerald eyes hid it. Everyone is to report any unusual gate activity to me and Marek for study. Any incidents where the gate called and no one was waiting for you on either side when you got there. We need to know what we are dealing with, because there is a very real possibility we are dealing with more than demons. A shiver rolled down Marek's spine at the prospect. Who in the hellspawn world would turn against him and his brothers? And Hades? What if it wasn't only hellspawn involved? He looked at his brothers, and their grave expressions revealed their thoughts were traversing the same unsettling paths his were. What if this went higher? He only had to look at the history of his world to see there were 1,000 grudges in play, and hundreds of people who might want to unseat Hades from his throne. 2 attempts to do such a thing had happened in the past, the last one resulting in demons being banished from the underworld. What if whoever was behind that uprising had been biding their time, waiting for this moment to strike and make another attempt? I'll hit the books and see what connections I can make, he said, and Karras finally acknowledged his existence, nodding his head in Marek's direction. I'll try to come up with a list of people who might possibly be involved. And he was going to start with whatever few accounts of the last uprising in the underworld existed in this world and in his library. We are on high alert. Be careful at the gates and be on your guard, especially you. Karras thawed a little as he looked at Marek, and Marek nodded, letting him know he would be careful. The enemy wouldn't get the jump on him again. Call if anything happens in Seville, even something that seems ordinary like the main gate calling to you. Do not go there alone without backup. We need to face this threat together. We are at our strongest together." Karis reached across the gap between them and laid a hand on Marek's left shoulder. Marek knew that, and was glad his brother did too. It was part of the reason he hated Karis being so cold and distant towards him. It weakened them. They were strongest when they were a united force. They didn't need Enyo driving a wedge between them, not right now, not when there was so much at stake. They needed to remain united, not divided, and that meant Karis needed to keep his head. He wasn't sure his brother could manage that where Enyo was concerned, though. She provoked his darker side, the possessive nature that ran as deeply in Karis's veins as it did in Marek's. A possessive side that had Marek stepping to the front porch, jamming his feet into his boots and teleporting again. Only it wasn't Seville that was his destination. He landed in a shadowy alley near the square where the vampire slayer had asked him to meet her, hoping like hell she would be waiting for him. Chapter 7. To say Katerina was annoyed was an understatement. She was fuming. She should have known better than to think the first man she had been attracted to in close to a decade would turn out to be punctual, respectful of her and her time, or interested enough in her to show up at all. She should have left when she said she would, but she had foolishly remained, wasting a further 2 hours in the hope the warrior would keep his word and join her on the hunt for the remaining vampires. Had he gone without her? She jammed her hands into the pockets of her leather jacket as she navigated the narrow alleys and swore under her breath, because if he had, she would never forgive him, not even if he apologized 1,000 times over. She didn't need anyone protecting her. She never had. When the police had started eyeing her where she had been waiting in the square for close to 3 hours, she had decided to call it. The warrior was a no-show. It wasn't going to stop her. She didn't know locations of possible vampire nests in the city as he proclaimed he did, but she knew where a vampire nest had been, and she might be able to get some information from it, possible clues as to other nest locations. She followed the alleys into the Gothic quarter, feet unerringly carrying her back to the building where she had slain 4 vampires last night. The warrior wasn't the only one who knew this city. She could have found her way to the old nest blindfolded. Katerina checked the wider avenue when she reached the arched wooden door of the nest, scouting in both directions to make sure she was alone. Satisfied that she was, she pushed the heavy door open and slipped inside, moving quietly in case any vampires had returned. She drew the blade from beneath her jacket and silently eased through the shadows towards the courtyard. The vampires from last night were little more than ash swirling in the light breeze now, their dust spread around the worn flagstones. She paused at the edge of the shadows and listened. Distant voices and the sounds of traffic on one of the main arteries were the only noises that reached her. She edged into the courtyard and checked all around it, her breath lodged in her throat as she checked every shadowy alcove beneath the walkway that ran around all 4 sides of it, columns and arches supporting the floors above. She kept her back to the wall and moved right, following that walkway around, listening the whole time. When she heard nothing other than the noises of the city, she moved forwards along the wall opposite the arched entrance, heading towards the corridor the vampire had emerged from last night. As she neared it, the start of a set of steps became visible in the gloom. She swiftly closed the distance between her and them, and followed them upwards to the first level of the building. It was quiet, only the sound of her breathing breaking the silence as she took in the peeling crimson-painted walls and the scant threadbare furniture. She had seen more luxurious nests in her time. This one looked as if someone had thrown it together in a hurry, foregoing luxury for the sake of having a modicum of comfort. A recent nest. Or perhaps these vampires had been young and poor, a new group that lacked the funds of their more established counterparts. There was money in murder. She had seen vampire nests filled with trinkets made of purest gold, sumptuous fabrics, and expensive art and technology. She supposed that the dead had no need of money or whatever had been on their person or in their house when the vampire had killed them. Katerina moved through the drawing room, heading for the next one. This one was in a better state, the eggshell blue walls freshly painted where bookcases didn't line them. A desk stood to her right, with its back to the windows that overlooked the courtyard. She hurried over to it, set her sword down on the worn mahogany top, and rifled through the papers scattered across it, setting aside any she found interesting. The air to her left shifted. Katerina grabbed her blade from the desk and lashed out with her weak hand, panic lancing her as her heart rate jacked up, and her mind screamed that a vampire had caught her off guard, something she had sworn would never happen. The tip of her blade settled against the throat of the man towering over her. His right eyebrow arched as his earthy eyes slid down to her sword, the flecks of gold and emerald emerging in them as he stared at it and then at her. He casually edged her blade away from his throat. "Fast reactions you have there." His deep voice rolled over her, warming her despite her effort to remain unaffected by him. Cold towards him. She ignored him, set her sword down on the desk, and continued her work, clinging to her mood as she found several interesting receipts, but not much else. Apparently, the nest had placed a few orders for better furniture before she had killed some of them and sent the rest running. It looked as if they had been settling in for the long haul, which wasn't in her favor at all. She had been hoping this would be a satellite nest of a larger group of vampires, one she had dealt with before, but it was looking more and more like a new group recently formed, which meant the chances of finding them at any of the 2 locations of previous vampire nests she knew in Barcelona was slim to none. "I am sorry." He moved around to the opposite side of the desk into her line of sight. She kept her focus on the papers, shifting another pile aside, refusing to give up even when she knew it was pointless. She wasn't going to find any information here. The information she needed was in the head of the dark-haired man opposite her, the one who obviously wanted to get her attention as he leaned over and planted his large hands on the edge of the desk. "Something came up." She shrugged stiffly, trying to let those words roll off her. They sank into her instead, softening the sharp edge off her mood and threatening to make her lose her grip on it. He had stood her up. She had waited 3 damned hours for him, longer than she had ever waited for a man before. "How long have you been here?" Katerina shoved a pile of papers at him, forcing him to remove one hand from the desk. He rose to his full height and sighed, the weary edge to it making her feel like a bitch. She was the one who had been put out, left like an idiot for all to see as they came and went from the square. She had tried to remain visible to make things easy on him, given how busy the square always was, had picked a spot beneath one of the towering palm trees that dotted it, close to the circular fountain in the center. She had remained visible all right. Several couples had eyed her on the way into the stunning rectangular square and on the way out again after they'd had a nice meal at one of the many restaurants that spilled into it. A few of them had looked at her with pity. "I am sorry," he said again, softer this time and in Catalan, his voice warming her right down to her marrow. He wasn't going to curry favor with her by speaking her native tongue rather than Spanish or English. She grabbed her sword and sheathed it. "There's nothing here. I should have looked somewhere else. I'm just wasting my time in this place." "I'm glad you looked here." She lifted her gaze to him and frowned as she spotted a cut darting across the straight line of his jaw, visible through the fine layer of stubble. "Why?" He smiled, one that warmed his eyes and curled lips made for kissing, turning his rough masculine features more handsome. "Because I found you." She peered deeper into his eyes and saw the relief there. Had he been worried when he had reached the square to find her gone? It struck her that part of her had been worried she would never see him again, the part she tried to tamp down as she kept a fragile grip on her mood. "You would have easily found me if you had been on time." She moved around the desk, heading for the exit to her left. He grabbed her arm before she made it more than 5 steps and spun her to face him. His eyes searched hers, intense and focused, sending a hot shiver through her as he palmed her elbow and drew her closer, until the heat of his body embraced her and she was aware of how tall he was, how strong he was, how handsome he was. "I meant to be on time," he husked, his gaze strained to her lips. "I really did. I have other duties, things I have to do." "Things that take priority over hunting vampires?" She kept her gaze locked on his eyes as they brightened in that eerie way, gold and emerald flakes shining against the dark backdrop of his irises, refusing to look at his mouth because she was afraid of what she would do if she did. The urge to kiss him was already strong, pounding as fiercely in her veins as it had last night when he had been this close to her. He nodded. "If my brothers knew I hunted vampires, I would be in serious trouble." Brothers. She filed that information away and seized her chance to learn more about him. "They're like you?" Another dip of his chin. And you fight what exactly? When he glanced at her, a frown marring his brow, she added, Your duty isn't hunting vampires, so what do you fight? It's obvious you're some sort of warrior. Warrior? He chuckled, and heat curled through her again as the rich timbre of it hit her hard. I suppose we are warriors, with a vow to defend our home, but not from vampires. Vampires are your sworn enemy. Demons are mine. Demons. She filed that away, too, her curiosity growing as she wondered what other species existed in his shadowy world. Like with horns and wings and pointed tails? 1,000 images popped into her head, all of them very biblical interpretations of the creatures. She had her upbringing to thank for that. While she always wore a silver cross around her neck, it was more of a deterrent to vampires rather than a symbol of faith these days. She had witnessed too much darkness in this world to believe there was any light to balance it. Some of them have those things, what you would think of as a traditional demonic being. Others are different. Most appear human. It doesn't matter to me. If they have demon blood, I kill them. She narrowed her eyes on him. Why are you telling me all of this? He grinned, a devastating one that blasted the last remnants of her anger with him into oblivion. Because you already know about my world, so it seems pointless to lie to you. But more than that, because I'm trying to make you like me again. She shook her head at that. Answer one question for me. No, two. He turned with her, ushering her towards the door. While we move, I have a place in mind that I would like to check out. She could go along with that. She let him lead her from the building and paused on the street outside it as another question came to her, one she couldn't stop herself from voicing. You can teleport, can't you? He looked back at her and didn't hesitate to nod. Among other things. Why? Do you want a lift? A lift? He was offering to teleport her? She recalled the black ribbons of smoke that had swirled around him, making him look as if the darkness itself had devoured him in that instant he had teleported. She shook her head. I like my feet firmly on the ground, thank you. He chuckled again and started along the street towards the Carrère del Bisbee. You might change your mind when you realize how far it is to the vampire nest. She hurried to keep up with him. His long legs made easy work of the distance, and although she was tall for a woman at 5'9", she struggled to remain beside him. The length of his stride and his pace meant one of two things. Either he was in a hurry, or he didn't walk with women very often. And you're 200 years old? She let that one slip out casually, hoping he would laugh or something and reveal he had been joking about his age. Plus 656. His lips pursed as his eyebrows dipped low. Bordering on 57. Katerina's eyes widened. Dale! He slid her a look. I'm not that old. 3 of my brothers are older. Since when had 856 going on 7 not been old? She felt like little more than a child at pushing 30. I don't want to know. She waved him away when he looked as if he might tell her how old his brothers were. Were those your 2 questions? He cast her another glance as they reached the main tourist route, and he guided her right, towards the square at the other end, where the elegant government buildings stood. No. She navigated her way around the groups of tourists blocking the narrow, cobbled pedestrian street, all of them snapping pictures of the sandstone-covered walkway that formed a bridge between 2 buildings on either side of the Carrère del Bisbee. The warrior took the other side, not bothering to ease around the crowd. He moved straight towards it, and several of the tourists took one look at him and pulled their friends or family members aside to give him room to pass. She wished she commanded that sort of respect. It probably came with age. Or possibly the fact he was 6'4" of pure muscle squeezed into tight fatigues and a dark linen shirt that hugged his well-defined chest and arms. Fine. More questions, but first answer one for me. He joined her again on the other side of the crowd, and she wanted to curse him when he picked up the pace again. She hated crowds, but at least they had been slowing him down. What do you want to know? She refused to chase after him as she took hold of the front of her black tank top and moved it back and forth, fanning herself as the stifling heat started getting to her. Or maybe it was the warrior cranking up her temperature to an unbearable degree. She watched as the distance between them grew as he hit the downward slope towards the square. He looked to his left where she would have been if she had been practically jogging to keep up with him, A frown crinkled his brow, and he peered back along the street. Katerina kept her pace reasonable, a level she could manage without becoming out of breath and sweating in a very unladylike fashion. I was walking too fast. Irritation flashed in his eyes, and he smiled tightly. I'm sorry. I'm not used to walking, let alone having female company. Another piece of information she filed away. If you want me to answer questions, I need to be able to speak. She reached him, and he fell into step beside her for a change, his gaze on his boots and hers until he had her pace mastered. He lifted his head, brushed a rogue wave from his forehead, and tucked his hands into his pockets. When he didn't speak, she said, You wanted to know something? His eyes met hers. What is your name? She stopped and held her hand out to him. Katerina. I won't burden you with all my names because it would probably take all night, but you can call me Katerina. Marek. He slipped his hand into hers, and the second they touched, lightning arced up her arm and heat bloomed in its wake, spreading through her as his large hand engulfed hers. His grip was strong but gentle, firm but light, as if he was afraid of hurting her, but he needed to feel the connection between them. She lowered her gaze to their joined hands and stared at them, marveling at how something as simple as holding his hand could affect her so deeply, had her falling all over again, deeply aware of how attracted to him she was. Her gaze drifted over his wrist and the thin braided black band that encircled it, up the corded muscles of his forearm to the rolled-up sleeve of his dark shirt. She let her eyes roam over his biceps, his broad shoulders, up to his neck. There was a small red line where her sword had made contact before he had stopped it, barely a nick, but it made her gut squirm and her eyes got stuck on it, even though she wanted to look at the rough masculine perfection of his face and see how he was looking at her. She wanted to know if that fire was in his eyes again, that hunger that echoed inside her too. Marek? She whispered, a little breathless. He sounded as lost as she felt. I'm sorry I cut you. His head turned, bringing the line of his jaw into view and then his bottom lip. He brought his free hand up, swept his thumb across the small cut, and brought it to his lips. Her heart pounded as she tracked it with her gaze, as she watched his lips part and his tongue swipe at the pad of his thumb. It's nothing. Don't worry about it. His soft chuckle heated her further. You're the first person to surprise me like that in a long time. Although maybe not a long time. Twice in a night. Must be losing my touch. Who else had been able to attack him before he could defend himself tonight? The business he'd had to deal with before he had come to meet her? She wanted to ask, but held her tongue, because his irises had changed again, the colors growing muted as they verged on black, and instinct told her that wasn't a good sign. She slipped her hand free of his and started walking again, missing the heat of his touch as she thought about all the things she wanted to ask him. Why do you hunt vampires? Marek fell into step beside her again and ushered her down another side street, towards a less touristy area of the quarter. She studied the sculpture of a tower that looked as if it had been made with enormous chicken wire as they passed through another square, mulling over how to answer that question without mentioning her brother. She had the feeling Marek liked killing vampires, and that he wouldn't distinguish a good one from the rest. And her brother was good. As far as she knew, he had never bitten anyone since his turning. At first because she had begged him to refrain, and later because his fangs never seemed to work whenever the urge to feed became too strong to resist. That dysfunction had been a blessing in her eyes when he had first revealed it to her, something to grant her more time to find a cure for him. Now there was a secret part of her that wished he could feed, because he was wasting away before her eyes. Personal reasons, to do with my family. I don't like to talk about it. She hoped he would let her leave it at that. She glanced across at him to gauge how he had taken it, and caught him frowning at the pavement ahead of them, his expression pensive and dark eyes narrowed. Why do you hunt vampires? Personal reasons. His tone gained a cold edge as his frown deepened, and she regretted asking when his eyes blackened, and she knew it wasn't the streetlights stealing the colors from them. They walked in silence for what felt like forever as she struggled to find a way to voice the question she needed answering the most. Fear held her tongue more than once. Not fear that he would piece together that her personal reasons regarding her family were because one of them was a vampire, but because she feared what his answer would be. When they reached a main artery, a busy multi-lane avenue with a tree-lined pedestrian walkway running along the center of it, she mustered enough courage and steeled her heart. "Marek," she murmured, fear stealing strength from her voice. When he looked at her, she pressed on, not daring to hesitate because she knew she would lose her nerve. "I've done a lot of research in the time I've been hunting vampires, but there's something I've never been able to discover." "What's that?" His steps slowed and she slowed with him, could almost sense his curiosity as he studied her as she diligently kept her profile to him, her eyes on the next crossing on the avenue. "Can a human who has been turned into a vampire be turned back into a human?" She swallowed hard as she waited, heart rushing, nerves rising. Marek tipped his head back and gazed at the trees. The silence between them stretched, tugging at her fears, giving them a stronger hold over her, and she was desperate for him to speak by the time he finally did. "Maybe." That wasn't much of an answer. Relief bloomed because it wasn't a definite no, but fear remained because it wasn't a definite yes. "You've never met a vampire who had been turned and ended up becoming human again?" His dark eyes slid down to meet hers, and the coldness in them sent a shiver through her. "I've never met a vampire I haven't killed. Not in the last few hundred years, anyway." She frowned at him as something hit her. "That sounds an awful lot like a vendetta to me." He shrugged his broad shoulders. "Call it whatever you want. The vermin deserve to die. I won't rest until every last one of them has been wiped from this realm." Another shudder racked her, and she wanted to take a step back from him, wanted to turn and leave right that moment, because she could see in his eyes that he meant what he had said. He wanted to kill every vampire he came across, because he despised them. Something had happened to him, something that had triggered a terrible need to hunt vampires, powerful enough that it demanded the death of every vampire in existence, or in this realm. Her eyebrows knitted hard as she thought about that. Strange choice of words. He started walking again. "This realm?" she asked as she looked at his back. It tensed as he ground to a halt. "Katerina," he murmured, voice low, the sound of her name spoken by him sending a devastating rush of heat through her that had her almost missing what he said next. "Some things about me and this world you're better off not knowing." "No, it's too late for that sort of talk." She stormed towards him, refusing to let him get his way. "I never asked to be part of this secret world, but I'm part of it now, and the more I know about it, the better my chances of survival. So I'm sorry. I need you to explain." He looked across at her, and she thought he would refuse to answer, but then the hardness in his eyes softened, and he sighed as he lifted his hand and brushed a strand of her hair from her face, his touch light, almost tender. "Fine," he husked. "But I'm only going to tell you this because you are right, and there is a chance being armed with this information might increase your chances of survival." And he wanted her to survive. It was right there in his eyes as those mesmerizing flecks of gold and emerald emerged, as he swept his knuckles across her cheek in a soft caress. "There are 3 realms. This one—" She cut him off as her eyes widened. "Heaven and hell. They're real." He shook his head. "They're not real?" His expression grew guarded. "Maybe. I don't know. Realms overlap." "Just how many realms are there? You said there were 3. "Were there more? Were heaven and hell real?" He shrugged. "I only have access to the realms of my world, but I know others exist. Valen, one of my brothers, is always proving that in Rome, and Escher has trouble with the native gods in Japan." Her head felt as if it was going to explode. Just how many realms was he talking about? And he was talking about gods as if they were real. Either he was delusional or he was telling the truth. She studied him. He had been honest with her so far, hadn't hidden anything because he wanted her to like him again, which made her suspect that every crazy-sounding thing leaving his lips was in fact real. "So which realms are the ones you were talking about?" That guarded edge to his expression returned, and he looked closely at her, as if expecting her to faint or swear, or react negatively to what he was going to say. "Olympus and the underworld, Katerina opted for swearing. Chapter 8. Katerina was still having a hard time coming to terms with the fact that Mount Olympus and the underworld apparently existed. Not only those two realms. As they had continued their walk, Marek had mentioned how the Roman pantheon of gods didn't get along with his brother Valen, and that his older brother who lived in Tokyo had a hard time convincing the local gods, Tengu and Oni, that he didn't mean any affront by living on their land. She had fallen silent after that, lost in thought as she tried to compute everything Marek had told her and make herself believe it. She was almost certain that he was telling her the truth about the worlds he walked in. It was just difficult to wrap her head around the idea that the shadowy world of vampires she had finally grown used to extended far beyond what she had thought possible. Yesterday, vampires had been the biggest of her worries. Now she knew about demons, and apparently demigods and gods were real too, among other things. The history books were coming to life around her, and she couldn't stop thinking about how many creatures of myth might be out there as real as she was. Marek paused at a crossing and checked the road before continuing onwards. "Where do you fit into it all?" She tried to keep her focus on the quiet streets around them, and not only for vampires. This area of her city wasn't the best one, and although she could handle herself, it still paid to be cautious, especially so late at night. Discomfort settled across his features. "That is probably a conversation for another night. We're close now. We should move with stealth." He was changing the subject because he didn't want to tell her, because she would find it as shocking as realizing multiple realms she had thought were a myth actually existed, or more shocking. The thought that she might find it more shocking made her want to press him for an answer, but he suddenly snatched her arm and pulled her behind a building. He pressed his hand to her stomach, pinning her back against the wall to his left, and leaned right to peer around the corner. Katerina kept still, focusing on her breathing to keep it level and quiet as she listened. If frightening her was his way of stopping her from pressing him for answers, she was going to kill him. Voices sounded distant and male. She couldn't make out what they were saying, but their accent was local. Marek looked at her and pressed the index finger of his free hand to his lips. She nodded and waited, becoming increasingly aware of his hand on her stomach, how the heat of it seeped through her tank and stirred a wicked sort of fire in her veins. He leaned away again, and she eased forwards, wanting to see what he was looking at. His hand pressed more heavily against her stomach, keeping her from moving, and he looked at her, looked down at his hand on her stomach, swallowed as he splayed his fingers, shifting the black material of her tank. The flecks of gold in his eyes brightened. He snatched his hand away from her and busied himself with checking his waistband, and cursing like a sailor for some reason. He twisted towards her and had her caged against the wall before she could blink, his hands pressing against it on either side of her head as his body hemmed her in. He lowered his mouth to her ear, and his warm breath sent a shiver through her as it caressed her skin. "Wait here." He disappeared, and she jumped, the suddenness of it startling her as she went from the delicious heat of his body to the cold touch of black tendrils of smoke. She swiped at them and moved to her left, placing some distance between her and the disturbing ribbons. They seemed to reach for her, and she hoped to God it was because she had moved, creating a shift in the air, and not because they were actually reaching for her. Marek suddenly reappeared right in the spot where he had been. He frowned at the empty wall and then across at her as he whispered, "I told you not to move." "No," she hissed low so the men didn't hear her. "You told me to wait here. I am here. I am not there because of those." She waved her right index finger up and down, gesturing to the creepy black smoke that drifted around him, the tendrils of it curling around his arms and caressing his neck like a lover. He looked as if he wanted to laugh. "It's harmless." He brushed his right hand through one section of the smoke and held it out to her. "See?" What she saw was the fact it seemed to writhe like a living thing in his palm, twining around his outstretched thumb as if it didn't want to leave him. He sighed. "It's just a lingering effect of the teleport." She shook her head, not interested in getting closer to it and not believing him. There was something sinister about that smoke, something that set her on edge. He shrugged, twirled the sheathed, curved knife he held in his left hand, and jammed it in the back of his combat trousers. "That's what you went somewhere for?" She jerked her chin to the knife. "I have one you could have borrowed." When she flashed the blade she kept in the inside of her jacket, he was the one who shook his head. "Only this blade. I swore that a long time ago." He moved before she could ask who he had sworn it to and why. The more she knew about him, the more questions she had, and the deeper she fell into a dark rabbit hole. Only unlike Alice, she wasn't falling into any wonderland. It was more of a world filled with nightmares. Vampires, demons, gods and goddesses, and who knew how many other wild and terrifying things lived in it. She hung back as Marek stalked forwards, striding with purpose towards where the men had been and were now gone. How wild and terrifying was he? On a scale of 1 to 10, she could probably handle him turning out to be somewhere in the 6 to 7 bracket. He clearly wasn't a demon, judging by how harshly he spoke of them, and he obviously wasn't a vampire. Maybe he was just a demon hunter, or a form of immortal warrior. He scowled over his shoulder at her. Katerina hurried to him, eyes scanning as she closed the distance between them, checking every dark corner for a sign of the vampires. Marek nodded towards a building at an intersection ahead of them, an apartment block that had seen better days. Independence flags hung from some of the balconies, but all of the plants on them were long dead. There were lights in the windows near the top floor. "Sorry about this." He looked up at the illuminated floor, his noble profile to her. "It's either this or leaving you here." Katerina didn't get a chance to ask him what he was talking about. He snaked his arm out, curled it around her waist, and hauled her up against him, and she grabbed hold of him with both hands as darkness whirled around her and the world spun into shadows. Cold slithered over her and she shuddered as she blinked in the inky black, desperate to see something as her senses were suddenly stolen from her. There was only black, only silence, only numbing ice. And then there was light and voices, and the warmth of Marek's body pressing against hers. Her head spun, twisting the world around her into a blur of colors, and the noises swam in her ears as her legs weakened beneath her, and bile rose up her throat. "You'll feel better in a moment." Marek released her, and something hissed. A vampire? Katerina slumped to her knees on the floor and gripped the tacky carpet, desperately clinging to it as if it would anchor her and stop the room from spinning. "Needed the element of surprise." Marek's voice rang in her ears, and then there was a grunt and another vicious hiss, and someone growled. The light flickered as glass smashed, dimming and making everything more bearable. The spinning in her head started to slow, things coming gradually into focus, forming 4 black shapes. Marek was one of them. She blinked and could make him out more clearly. He remained in front of her, blocking the path of the 3 male vampires as they swiped at him with their claws, all of them baring their fangs, their eyes vivid crimson. The one to her right looked beyond her, taking his eyes off Marek for only a second. Katerina looked behind her. The door there had locks on it. The only exit? Marek had managed to teleport her into their nest and block the exit at the same time. She would have been impressed if she hadn't wanted to vomit so badly. She swallowed hard, trying to keep it down and keep it together, and exhaled hard. Marek glanced over his shoulder at her. The vampire to his left sprang at him. "Marek!" she screamed. He was gone in a flash, and the vampire stumbled through the black smoke he left behind. His red eyes narrowed, a frustrated snarl peeling from his lips as he realized Marek was gone, and then he looked down at her where she sat on the dirty gray carpet, and grinned. "Not so fast." Marek appeared behind him and thrust his knife into the vampire's side, spilling blood down his black jeans. The vampire shrieked and tore away from him, ripping the wound open so the flow of crimson became a waterfall that rapidly drenched the carpet and crept towards her. The other 2 vampires attacked at once. Katerina pulled herself together and tore her leather jacket off as she shot to her feet. She reached around behind her, drew her blade, and swept below the arm of the first vampire as he lashed out at her, leaving himself wide open. She tried to land a blow on him, but the second vampire spotted her before she could get close. He kicked at her arm, and she cried out as his boot connected, sending fire zinging along her bones. Marek loosed an unholy growl and grabbed her by the strap of her sword sheath and pulled her backwards as the black-haired vampire struck again. His boot shot through the air where her face had been. Marek twisted her around him so her back was to his, and brought his hand around in a vicious arc, his silver knife a blur as it sliced through the air. The black-haired vampire leaped backwards on a hiss, clearing the length of the room. Marek's dark gaze swept around the room, and he frowned at the same time as she did. This room was far too cluttered for a fight, the overlarge sofa and coffee table getting in the way, giving the vampires objects they could hide behind to slow her and Marek down. She had to clear some space. Whether she could do that without losing her neck or a pint of blood to the vampires was another matter. Marek tossed his knife to his left hand and swept his right one out before her, his palm facing the sofa and table. The large dark red sofa shot backwards towards the mousy-haired vampire who had moved behind it for cover. He leaped over it, barely avoiding being pinned against the wall by it and landing with one booted foot on it before he gingerly sprang from it and towards her. The coffee table suddenly shot up between her and the vampire, and he plowed into it. She flinched away, expecting both of them to hit her, curling into a protective position as she waited for the collision and the inevitable pain. It didn't come. Instead of hitting her, the vampire and the table flew backwards, slamming into the wall above the couch. Marek muttered, "Breaking my own damned rules here." He tossed his blade back to his right hand and glared at both of the vampires. The mousy one gathered himself, snarling as he tossed the wooden table aside and dropped down from the sofa. He wiped blood from his nose, his eyes fixed on her the entire time, as if it was her fault the furniture had suddenly attacked him. Maybe it was. Marek had somehow hurled the coffee table at the vampire to keep him away from her, something which had apparently broken the rules of engagement. She wasn't sure the vampires were aware of these rules, as the black-haired one picked up a lamp and hurled it right at her, as if testing a theory. Her warrior caught it and hurled it right back at him with enough force to leave a dent in the plaster when the vampire dodged it and careened into the wall. The vampire's slow grin said it all. She was Marek's weakness. They were going to attack her to provoke him, forcing him to lose his cool so he would make a mistake. It wasn't going to happen. She was no damsel in distress. She didn't need Marek to protect her. She could handle herself. She stepped up beside him, readied her blade, and stared down the mousy-haired vampire as he edged around the room, heading towards the windows to her right, maneuvering her between him and Marek. No, she realized that wasn't his intent as he leaned down to reach behind a worn armchair and metal dragged against the skirting board. He straightened, revealing a length of solid steel pipe gripped in his right hand. Katerina drew down a fortifying breath. Her sword was strong, but she wasn't sure it would stand up to the strength of a vampire combined with a thick length of steel. Marek huffed. She risked a glance in his direction, looked beyond him to the other vampire where he stood in the door to the next room, a huge kitchen knife in his hand. "Hardly going to level the playing field." Marek twirled his blade, dark menace written in every line of his face as he braced his feet shoulder-width apart and hunkered down. The black-haired vampire rolled his neck and eased his shoulders back. The one closest to her grinned and weighed his weapon. Marek might still like the odds, but she didn't. They only got worse when the door behind them opened and another vampire walked in, froze as she took in the scene, launched at Marek on a vicious hiss. He pivoted so his back was to Katerina's and slammed his fist into the female's chest as she flew through the air. Bone crunched, the sound twisting Katerina's stomach, and the female cried out as she fell backwards, hitting the floor in a sprawl near the door. "Estelle, run!" The black-haired vampire threw himself at Marek, swiping wildly with the blade he brandished, keeping Marek busy as the woman tried to pull herself onto her feet. Estelle clutched her chest and wheezed, staggered onto her feet, and shook her head as she looked at the male, her eyebrows furrowing as fear flooded her crimson eyes. He growled in response to that, the pain in it catching Katerina off guard. They were lovers. Hesitation beat through her for the first time ever when she had been fighting vampires. She had battled them countless times, had watched them from the shadows, but never had she witnessed anything like this. She had seen males and females together, but it had never looked as if what they were doing was anything more than casual, a sating of primal needs. The way Estelle looked at the black-haired vampire as he battled Marek, keeping him busy, pure fear written across every line of her face, said that what she felt for him was more than a primal need, more than lust. It was love. Katerina gasped when Marek twisted on his heel, rammed his shoulder into the gut of the male vampire, lifting him off the ground and knocking the wind from him, and hurled his blade at Estelle at the same time. It nailed her in the shoulder, burying deep and ripping a scream from her as she went down. Estelle! The black-haired vampire grabbed Marek, sinking claws into him, ripping long gashes in his dark linen shirt as he fought to get free of Marek's grip. Marek kicked off, launching forwards, and slammed the male's spine into the doorframe, tearing a grunt from him. The vampire tore a grunt of his own from Marek, bringing his right knee up hard into Marek's stomach as he finally got a good hold on him. He kneed Marek once, twice, and then a third time. Estelle ripped the blade from her shoulder and hurled herself towards Marek on a vicious cry. All sympathy Katerina had felt for the woman and her lover instantly dissipated. She leaped into the brunette's path and swept her sword around. It connected with Marek's knife and the vampire's hand. Estelle grunted as the silver sliced into her and dropped Marek's knife. The knife didn't hit the floor. When it was close, it suddenly shot past Katerina, coming close to grazing the shin of her calf-height leather boots. A male bellowed behind her, and Katerina's heart leaped into her throat. Marek. She shoved forwards with her sword, driving Estelle back, giving herself space to breathe so she could check on Marek. She cast a frantic glance over her shoulder, and relief poured through her when she saw he was fine. The vampire hadn't fared so well. As Marek stumbled back a step, revealing the male, Katerina grimaced. The hilt of the short blade protruded from underneath the vampire's chin. His red eyes were glazed, dulling rapidly as he slumped against the wall and began to slide down it. Marek gripped the blade and pulled it free, filling the heavy silence with a wet sucking sound. Estelle screamed. Katerina blocked her before she could throw herself at Marek, pinned her back to his, and fought the female away, lashing at her with her sword. The woman snarled, fangs flashing and scarlet eyes glowing dangerously as she hunkered down. The mousy-haired vampire stared at his fallen comrade, his eyes wide as the male began to disintegrate, and then turned on Marek and Katerina with a low, rumbling growl. Marek moved with her as the male attacked, blocking the vampire's steel bar with either his knife or his hand. Katerina fell into the fight with him, all of her focus shifting to surviving as Estelle pulled a knife from beneath her short violet jacket. The blade flashed as the vampire attacked, her movements so swift that Katerina struggled to keep up with her as she jabbed and slashed, thrust and withdrew. Heat blazed across her biceps and the left side of her chest and then across her right forearm, and she bit back the cry that wanted to leave her lips as the scent of her blood filled the air, and fear crept up on her. Marek growled and twisted with her, swapping positions so she was facing the male instead. He glared at her, red eyes narrowing as she brought her sword up between them, daring him to make the first move. The heat that burned in her cuts became a fire that blazed in her blood as she fought with Marek at her back. She had never had a partner before, had never thought she would have one, but it felt good to know he was there behind her, watching out for her. She liked how they worked in tandem with each other, as if they had been made to fight together as a unit. It was exhilarating, a little bit thrilling. She blocked the vampire's steel bar and swept her sword out, keeping him on the back foot and trying to drive him into a confined space so she could finish him. The sound of the fight happening behind her threatened to distract her, but she somehow managed to keep her focus on her own opponent. The mousy-haired male suddenly sprang at her and she reared, her back plastering against the solid, powerful heat of Marek's. He turned slightly and brought his arm up as the vampire swung, blocking the bar with his forearm and taking a blow that would have hit her in the side of her head. The vampire's eyes widened as he realized what had happened, and Katerina didn't hesitate. She gripped her sword with both hands and brought it up in a fast arc, putting all of her strength and speed into it so he wouldn't have time to dodge it. The blade slashed up his chest, slicing clean through his shirt and his flesh beneath it, the cut deep enough that she saw bone as he reeled backwards on a pained hiss. Estelle cried out at the same time, and a thud sounded, but Katerina didn't take her eyes off her vampire, trusting that Marek could handle the female. Had handled the female, judging by the noises that came from behind her, bubbling and fizzing that filled Katerina's mind with a blur of memories, all of them blending together into one disgusting stream of disintegrating vampires. The male in front of her hit the deck, his knees colliding hard with the carpet, and stared down at his chest, at the gaping wound that spilled crimson as his flesh began to blister and burn. He started babbling in Catalan, desperate, frightened words that tore at her. Katerina closed her eyes and swept her blade out, tensed as it met with resistance, and he fell silent. She exhaled, releasing the breath she had been holding. It was over. The usual fear that gripped her after a battle didn't come this time. Her pulse remained fast, her blood buzzing as she breathed, and she felt the heat of Marek behind her. He took her sword from her hand and sheathed it for her, and placed her jacket over her shoulders, sending a shiver racing up her arms as he gently caressed them and eased her back against his hard chest. His delicious heat sank into her as he banded his arm around her stomach, kept the cold at bay as he teleported with her. The stifling warmth of a summer night surrounded her, a breeze buffeting her as it swept in from the sea, carrying the scent of salt water to chase away the horrid stench of blood. "Are you all right?" Marek eased her to face him, and she slowly opened her eyes as the weird swirling sensation faded, and she was confident she wasn't about to fall to her knees or vomit. The heat of battle kept it at bay, burned inside her as fiercely as it burned in his eyes as he checked her over, the gold and emerald flecks in his brown irises blazing brightly in the low light rising from the streets below them. Katerina stared up at him, transfixed, unable to take her eyes off him as he looked her over, as he inspected her wounds with a tender touch and concern in his gaze. The fire burning inside her grew hotter, brighter, consuming her from the inside out as it filled her mind with wicked thoughts, with a need that rapidly became impossible to deny as the fact she had survived sank in. She was alive. She wanted to feel it. Marek lifted his head, his eyes locking on hers. His voice was low, a belly-heating purr as awareness dawned in his eyes. "Katerina." She didn't give him a chance to voice whatever doubts were building inside him, whatever attempt he might make to stop this from happening. She grabbed him by the nape of his neck, pulled him down, and kissed him. Chapter 9. This was just adrenaline, a crazy post-battle high that was too powerful to resist. Katerina kept telling herself that as she kissed Marek, as his warm lips met and mastered hers, sending a sharp thrill tumbling down her spine and spreading over her limbs. He turned with her and pressed her against a wall on the dark roof of the oceanfront building, the low moan that rumbled in his chest as their bodies came into contact, pulling a groan from her own lips. His large hands claimed her waist, slid up to her ribs, and tugged her closer to him. The desperate clash of his lips with hers, a frantic and choppy meeting and parting of their mouths, spoke to her, telling her that she wasn't alone. The same fierce, undeniable need poured through him, too. A need that left her feeling as if she might die if she didn't satisfy it soon, easing this consuming hunger to have him, to feel his lips on every inch of her flesh, and fulfill the attraction that had burned inside her from the moment she had set eyes on him. He pushed the jacket from her shoulders and skimmed his hands down her arms, another shiver chasing in the wake of his light touch. His tongue brushed her lower lip just as softly, and she opened for him, moaned as he angled his head, and their mouths fused. His left hand claimed her nape, tunneled into her hair, and pulled her head back. He kissed her deeper, claiming all of her, his kiss a drug she couldn't get enough of as she surrendered to him. Katerina placed her hands on his arms, heart pounding at her first touch, at the feel of his corded biceps beneath her palms. They were rock hard, tensed as he pulled her flush against him and held her there, as if he wanted her to know his strength. She was already deeply aware of it, of how powerful he was, and it spoke to her on a primal level where she wasn't quite master, had her arousal ratcheting up another 10 degrees until it was unbearable, and all she could think about was how badly she needed him. He groaned and trembled as she stroked her hands upwards, over the bulge of his shoulders to his neck, and lightly stroked there, teasing the short hair at the nape before plowing her fingers through the longer lengths at the back of his head. She pulled him harder against her and stole control of the kiss, something deep inside her driving her to push him to the very edge, to the point where he wouldn't be able to think, let alone resist her, because she needed this. And no way in hell was she going to give him a chance to back down. She swore he could read her mind as he plastered one hand to her shoulder and eased her back against the wall, as he dropped his other one to the waist of her jeans and glared at them, his face etched with concentration as he unfastened them. His rough breathing filled the silence, mingling with her own panted exhalations as she focused on what he was doing, as she waited for that first delicious brush of his fingers over her flesh. He didn't make her wait long. He shoved her jeans down her legs, dropped to his knees before her, and tore off her boots. She kicked her jeans off, as eager as he was, as the need spiraling through her coiled in her belly, heating it and making her restless. Marek lifted his head and stilled. His eyes blazed in the gloom, on fire with a need she ached to satisfy as his gaze slowly lifted from her hips, drifting over her stomach and her breasts before finally meeting hers. "Marek," she murmured, unsure what to say, but needing to say something to let him know she was right there with him, as maddened by lust as he was, on the verge of begging him to do something to ease it. He shot to his feet so fast she gasped. He swallowed that gasp in a kiss as he cupped her cheeks, backing her against the wall and devouring her. Her hands shook as he dropped his to her hips and skimmed them over her bare skin, his touch feather light, a stark contrast to the hardness and ferocity of his kiss. She moaned as he palmed her backside and lifted her, a deeper groan following it as she wrapped her legs around his waist, and it finally sunk in that they were going to do this. That itch she'd had for him since they had met was going to be scratched at last. Part of her wanted to slow things down, wanted to take a moment to explore his body, to do something to make this moment of madness last longer. She couldn't slow her kiss, though, couldn't stop herself from rocking against his caged erection. The solid steel of it between her thighs as he ground into her only made the fire burn hotter, a blistering inferno that turned all of her control to ashes. Katerina gripped his shirt, twisting both sides of it into her fists and pulled it apart, ripping a low moan from Marek as buttons flew everywhere, pinging away into the darkness. She planted her hands against his bare chest, groaned and shuddered as she met firm, hot skin dusted with hair, and found each of his pectorals larger than her hands could cover. Sweet hell! She rocked against him, faster now as she explored his chest, as she dropped her hands lower to his stomach and the heat pooled and coiled lower in response to the feel of his abdominals beneath her questing fingers. The man had the body of a god, a warrior. She shuddered and groaned, grabbed his nape and kissed him harder, wishing it was dawn so she could see his body, could explore it with her eyes as well as her hands. It was his turn to shudder as she reached his navel and dipped lower, twisting her hand towards him and cupping the bulge confined in his fatigues. He slammed one hand against the wall beside her head and tightened his grip on her hip with his other one, clutching as she stroked him, exploring the rigid length of him. "Katerina," he husked, and she drifted her hand back up to the waist of his black trousers and tackled the first button. Marek kissed along her jaw, dropped his lips to her throat and suckled it, licking the sensitive spot behind her ear and sending wave after wave of shivers through her as she freed his cock. He stilled and shuddered again as her palm finally met bare flesh, as she stroked her hand from blunt tip to his balls. Velvet on hot steel. She trembled and ached, moaned as she ran her hand back up the length of him. Marek gripped the waist of her black panties by her left hip and yanked, ripping a gasp from her as he tore them away. He ripped another from her as he filled her with one hard thrust, plunging to the hilt inside her and slamming her back into the wall. She trembled, quivered as her mind struggled to catch up, as a wave of bliss rolled through her, the feel of him stretching and filling her, scattering her thoughts, leaving only feeling behind. He gripped her hips, withdrew, and plunged into her again, thrusting deeper as he angled his hips, his pelvis brushing her sensitive bud as her hands flew to his shoulders. She dug her nails into them, desperate to anchor herself as he went to war on her, a battle she felt sure she would lose in only a few strokes as he curled his hips, driving her into the wall with each powerful thrust. His mouth seized hers again, and she lost herself in the kiss, in each wicked thrust of his hips, every meeting of their bodies that sent a wave of bliss through her. She tugged him closer, wrapped her arms around his neck, and clung to him as she rode those waves, as he palmed her backside and quickened his pace. Even then, it felt as if he was holding back. Was he afraid of hurting her with his strength? The question scattered on the sea breeze as he deepened their kiss, a wild and desperate edge to it as his lips clashed with hers and their bodies met and parted. She dug her nails into his neck as she finally caught up, and satisfaction washed through her when she rocked her hips, rushing to meet him, and he moaned and shook, his hands trembling where they gripped her. He hooked her right leg over his arm, did the same with her left one, and dug his fingers into her bottom as he thrust into her. She cried into his mouth as his body slammed against hers and her release crashed over her, struggled to keep her grip on him as wave after wave of shivers shot down her thighs and up her spine, as she quivered around his cock. He didn't slow. He growled and filled her again, the new position allowing him to push deeper, until she could feel every inch of him. She moaned as she gave herself over to him, as the haze of her orgasm began to pass and pleasure built again, the itch for him proving persistent as he thrust into her, moving faster now, his breathless moans filling her ears between kisses. "Marek!" She turned her head to one side, tipped it back and arched forwards as he thrust deeper still, his hips curling, his hard length hitting her in just the right spot. He kissed and licked her neck, suckled it so hard she was sure she would have a bruise as he plunged into her, slamming her spine into the wall. She held his head to her neck, closed her eyes and strained, desperate to reach another high with him. She tensed around him. He grunted and slammed into her, his cock pulsing and throbbing as he spilled and his fast breaths bathing her throat. Katerina moaned as the feel of his climax had her joining him, her core quivering again as a subtler wave of pleasure rolled over her. She sank against the wall, all of her strength leaving her as she savored it, and she slowly came down from the rush of it all and awareness gradually returned. Marek gathered her to him and rested his forehead against her neck, his rapid breathing filling the silence as she held him, refusing to regret what she had just done. The post-battle high hadn't been responsible for this moment of madness. She could see that now. It had just been the perfect excuse. She wanted Marek. She wanted him in a way she had never wanted anyone before, in a way that heated her blood to 1,000 degrees but chilled her at the same time, because she had never been in love before, and she had the feeling she was going to fall hard for Marek, and that was more frightening than facing 100 vampires, because she wasn't sure she would survive this. He would find out about her brother, and then he would break her heart.